I call this meeting to order, please. I want to welcome everybody in the audience here and our board members, as well as those watching by live streaming. First order of business, I'll ask Casey Griffin to call the order.
Mr. Cobbins. Here. Mr. Darnell. Here. Mr. Eby.
Here.
Mr. Edwards.
Here.
Mr. Ferguson.
Here.
Ms. Kim. Mr. Krause. Ms. Tucker.
Here.
Ms. Hartgrove. Mr. Chair, you have 7 present voting members.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. We have a quorum and we are duly convened. Without objection, Chairman Hartgrove is excused. Is there any objection to that? Okay.
I didn't know we had that on.
I wish you were here. Anyway, today, first, objection so ordered. Without objection so ordered. I would like to actually ask Dr. Morrison if she wants to give a recap on yesterday.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, just very briefly, for those of you that weren't with us yesterday, we had a full day. We started here in the morning with our workshop. The board members heard from various presenters about a number of topics, including kind of a recap of last year's master plan and some of the accomplishments and things we still have left to do from our priorities as established for the 18-19 school year. We heard from the department a brief update about the timeline and the work happening on the Education Savings Account program. We also had an extensive discussion about the English as Second Language policy updates that are coming on first reading today. And we heard from the department about the pre-KK portfolio alternatives, which is something the board will be voting on and working with the department closely on in the coming months. Then we went out to Smyrna and had lunch with the folks from THEC, the commission members who serve for the higher ed counterpart to this board. We went together on a tour of the Nissan plant, which was, for me, one of the highlights of the day. It was fascinating, and we all learned a lot and saw a lot of the implications of the work that we do in terms of ensuring students have skills and knowledge that will serve them well in their ultimate career paths. And then we had a joint workshop meeting with THEC in the late afternoon where we heard from some folks from Rutherford County about the workforce development initiatives and the K through 16 efforts happening there. We'll talk a little bit more today when that item comes up in terms of one of their educator prep programs coming out of some of that work in Rutherford County. And then we had, again, one more presentation between the two boards, THEC and State Board, kind of understanding what it's like to be a student in that full K-16 experience in various corners of the state. So it was a full day. We're back here bright and early this morning and ready to dig in, but thank you for all of you that were with us yesterday, and that's all I have, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. We do appreciate THEC hosting us yesterday for our annual meeting. It was great. I'd like to recognize Ms. Tucker. I think she has some guests that she would like to recognize.
I do. Thank you, Bob. So I did this yesterday with a few of them, but I think they're all here today. I have the honor of working with a fantastic group of folks who are in the Urban Leaders Fellowship. So they're working here this summer in Nashville, some from Nashville, some from other parts of the country, on policy issues. They work in the morning with partner organizations and work in the afternoon on policy issues that I have asked them to work on. And so they've been working on charter authorizer oversight, on the new, best practices around education savings accounts, on high needs reimbursements for students with disabilities, on all things, Mike, you'll be happy to hear, all things educator, quality, prep, retention, diversity. That's Mike's bag. And on my favorite topic, parent empowerment. And so they are here, and I said this yesterday, but I want to say it again today. Anything smart I talk about in any of those topics came from them and their presentations to me earlier this week. So if they could just stand up and be recognized by the board, that would be great. And maybe we can even get a picture after the meeting. There's a lot of brain power there. So.
And if Ms. Tucker does represent you, then you're doing it very well, because she's a very good member of this board. With that, I would like to remind all of our presenters today to please recognize themselves, stating their name and where they represent when they speak, and also, again, recognizing that we are being live streamed across the state. Please refrain from using jargon and acronyms. That would help people a lot better then. With that, we will go to our first item of business, which is our consent agenda. I will note, hopefully the board members noticed that there was a change in the November 2020 date. It got moved up 1 week. That was sent out to you earlier. And there has been a request to pull 3 items with regard to the licensure action C, F, and I. So with that, can I have a motion to accept the consent agenda?
So moved.
A motion from Mr. Edwards,
Second.
and a second from Ms. Tugger. Any discussion? No discussion. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Our next item is a report item we won't be voting on. I'd like to recognize Ms. Aaliyah Guthrie from the Department of Education.
Good morning. My name is Aaliyah Guthrie. Gotta get used to this mic. I work at the Department of Education and I am the Director of Policy. I am just presenting an informational item. As you know, the state board approves courses and also approves graduation requirements, but I'm here to present the courses that are functioning as substitutes for English 3 and 4, the 3rd lab science, and the 4th math. I believe you have the list of those course substitutions in front of you, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions?
Just a comment. I know this board has indicated an interest in looking at graduation requirements and sort of holistically going through to see what we require, where we might make some adjustments. I think this is an important list to inform those conversations in terms of where districts already have some flexibility.
And I have a question with regard, later we're going to vote on looking at substitution courses, et cetera. How is it decided which ones are accepted and which ones are not accepted?
So when a new course is brought to you all, when that document is presented, there is a section that lists what potential courses it could substitute for. So recently, you all approved the BioSTEM 3 and the BioSTEM Practicum, Engineering of Principles. Those now function and that's listed in their course code document, that they function as a 3rd lab science or as a math substitution. We are working with school counselors all the time to be aware of what the substitutions are that already exist for their students, and then taking their feedback about, this is a course that we're offering, would it be possible for it to sub in for that 4th math or something like that. So those are updated in the course code management system that we have when we get that feedback from districts. Previously, they were listed in all of these substitutions were listed in the approved high school courses policy 3.205, but it became very cumbersome, difficult to read, and so instead it's just in the course code management system now.
So is there a committee or something that actually looks at the curriculum of the particular course that's being requested, and then the committee says, yes, I think this is something that we should approve, or no, we shouldn't approve, and if you don't approve it, do you explain to them why it's not been approved?
I can't speak to what the internal process is specifically. I know that our content team and the academic team at the department is reviewing the standards to ensure that they're rigorous enough to qualify as a 3rd lab science or as a 4th year math. But I don't know who are all the people at the table. I just can't speak to who they include.
I'd like to better understand that at
Yes,
some
sir.
point in time, because I noticed some that have been denied, and I looked at the titles of them, and they looked pretty good to me, but I didn't know what was in the curriculum. So.
And just one comment on that too, as we get into that sort of follow-up discussion, the distinction between a special course and a grad requirement, I think we'll need to make sure we understand, because some of those special courses that you may be referring to don't actually substitute for grad requirements. Some may, but in any case, when we get further into that conversation,
Okay.
Aaliyah, I'm sure we'll be calling on you.
Yeah, we have a special course item that's later on. So Virginia Mayfield, who's here, she may be able to, I know she'll be able to speak to the special course approval, but she may also be able to provide some insight on the substitution approval.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Thank you. Next is a number of action items. Remembering that items 3H through M, we will include as consent agenda and vote on those if there's no objection to that. Without objection, is so ordered. We'll go to our first item then. Item A, English as a second language. Ms. Katie Barcy.
Good morning. My name is Katie Barcy, and I am the Assistant Director of English Learner Programs at the Tennessee Department of Education, and I have with me Jan Lanier. She is the Director of English Learner Programs at the Department of Education, and I'm here to present the updates to the ESL Program Policy 3.207 for first reading. These proposed policy changes seek to update the exit criteria on the WIDA Access Assessment for English learners, as well as establish exit criteria for the WIDA Alternate Access Assessment for English learners with significant cognitive disabilities. In addition, we have added a few updates to language and minor wording clarifications and restructuring of sections in the policy as well. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, Ms. Tucker.
It's me again. So we did this for a while yesterday, so I'm not going to rehash everything from yesterday other than to say I know this is on first reading, and I am really interested in the information that you guys were going to get to provide to us through, I guess, through Amy before second reading, because I do have a lot of concerns, particularly about the test, the exit test for students with disabilities who are ELs and what all that means. Like, just voting on that, like, sort of blindly is not something I'm comfortable doing. So I can vote on it for first reading with the understanding that we're going to get information and that I'm going to need on second reading. A question that I have, I reached out to someone in the advocacy community just to get their feedback, and they had quite a bit of feedback on the rule, or on the policy, I'm sorry. And so between first and second reading, I'm going to get that to Ms. Owen and let you guys have a conversation. But I'm curious as to what kind of outreach actually did occur when you were doing this, because they had not heard anything from the department about it.
Okay.
We partner with Tennessee Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages, which is an international organization, and we're the Tennessee affiliate. And we have a conference every year that has between 250 and 500 people. Last year we presented all of this at the conference. The year before it was mentioned. So, and we have asked for feedback. So we had some feedback from people that were attending that. We also do an institute to talk about the education law that's in place. We're calling it the ESSA Institute now. We presented this last year to that group. Across the state, we covered most of the districts that have English learners. And we're trying to make sure they get their feedback. We will be happy to reach out again after first reading, if appropriate, and provide an extra survey to see if there are things that need to be changed or need to be considered. And I look forward to that, Wendy. We actually had your document ready by close of business yesterday, but didn't assume we've sent it on, so you'll be getting it very soon.
Great. And so I'm glad that you're reaching out to EL teachers and districts. I'm also interested in the advocacy community for students who are EL learners. And so I think that community has a lot to offer from the advocacy perspective that would improve the policy and rules around kids who are EL learners. So like Conexión Americanas, we have some great people in this city and in the state and nationally. So I would encourage you to reach out to those folks as well.
We do. We have reached out informally to Turk. We can make that more formal. I have a contract with Conexión. They handle our migrant program, which is basically an EL program also. So we will firm that up a bit more.
Okay, great.
Be happy to.
And then another thing I wanted you to think about, see, I told you I was going to be wordy here. Another thing I wanted you to think about on the EL policy as you're sort of revamping this policy, we talked a lot yesterday about when you raise, if raising the exit criteria goes through, right? If we pass that on first and final reading and more students remain in the system and are getting EL services, like what that would mean financially and as a burden on schools, right? And so one of the things I feel like it would be important to do that could help ease that burden and help support those students is look at this policy and see where you can put in some parent interaction and parent empowerment. Because right now, I don't see a whole lot of parent access to any of this. I mean, there's no, unlike IDEA, and I know there's no federal law on this, like parents don't have a whole lot of rights with kids who are EL students. And so I would encourage the department, this board, our state, to look into developing policies that make parents partners in this work, because I think, A, it's better for the kids, right? It's better for the families. But also, I think if you're worried about fiscal impact, that bringing in the parent piece is going to be like an inexpensive way to get this work done and get it done better. So I would encourage some, and have some fellows who've worked on some thoughts on parent empowerment in this area that I am happy to share with the department.
Thank you. We have talked about having parent partners. They are part of our stakeholders group for the ESSA stakeholder meeting. But Katie and I have talked that that's probably not intensive enough. And that is in our plans, that there will be groups across the state where we can talk with parents and get more input. And I want to, if it's okay, I'd like to speak to the funding issue.
Yep.
BEP funds at 1 to 20. So for every 20 teachers, for every student, one teacher for every 20 English learners. Most of our districts are not staffing anywhere near that. The two districts that we discussed yesterday are much closer to the 1 to 35, which is the upper requirement. And what we say is you have to meet the needs within that. You can go up to 1 to 35, but you need to be meeting the needs. And I feel like when we worry that when districts are telling us they don't have the funds to staff, that they're choosing to use those funds in a way, in another way. And if there were no funds from BEP, if there were no federal funds, the law still requires that these students have service and have access to full curriculum.
Just on the parent piece, I just want to make sure I'm clear. I appreciate that you would involve them in some of the decision making. What I'm talking about is parents being involved in the ILP process, in getting a copy of it in their native language, in being consulted, in actual interaction at the school level, with parents being a part of and partners in that, just like they are theoretically or like legally for kids with disabilities. And I think, I know just sort of offline, Nick and I were chatting about ILPs in his district, and I think you see more of that in your district. And I think if that was in policy or even in rule, that, and I think the federal law would allow that. That's why I asked about the federal law yesterday. I think federal law would support that because of the meaningfulness requirement for meaningful education, that we could actually get more success for EL students and do all sorts of great things as far as like what parent involvement does in the school system. So that's what I'm talking about, actually policy and rule with parent involvement.
I agree. Thank you.
Other questions, Ms. Kim?
Yeah, it's less, well, maybe it's a question. I mean, so yesterday I expressed both enthusiasm for the notion that we might aim higher. That is deeply appreciated in my soul, that notion. But also a lot of concern about whether or not it's rooted in some of the realities on the ground and our ability to execute. And I think that, I guess, I don't know, maybe I'll just make a statement. I don't know if it's a question, but I'm somehow feel deeply confused still about what the right lever is to pull to try and ensure that our kids are best served. This might be the way. You raise the bar. Everyone, despite all the challenges at the level of the practitioner, will just have to figure out a way to step up and meet it. I mean, there's a part of my brain that says, I get it. And then part of me, though, because there's still questions in my head, is I'm not totally convinced. So it leaves me in a little bit of a dilemma. Like, I certainly want to provide services. There's no question to the impetus that you spoke at the end of the session yesterday. I applaud that. I am all for making sure that our kids get what they need, obviously. What I'm uncertain about is how we get there. And I just wasn't sure, not that I expect a full answer now, but like what would be the right set of levers to pull to ensure that? So then that leaves me thinking, okay, do I say no now in hopes that then something, like, it can be figured off like now, offline? Or do we say yes now and then just hope it all sorts itself out in the wash later? And that is a real dilemma for me. I actually just don't know what to do here.
May I respond?
Yes.
Okay. I know it was a statement and not particularly a question, so I didn't want to overstep. But I think what Ms. Tucker said certainly carries weight, because the ILP is the lever we need to be using to drive this instruction. It individualizes it. And a student that's exiting now with a 4.2, that we want to exit with a 4.4 to align with our 10 ready ELA assessments, will have different needs student to student. And we all accept that no two students are the same, the needs are going to be different. And having that ILP, that individual learning plan for the English learner, should help the teachers determine which levers need to be pulled and how they'll move that forward. We did intensive training across the state with teachers, with administrators, with principals on those ILPs. We are happy to revisit that and to talk about that. I do think getting the parents involved will make a huge difference. So thank you for caring.
Mr. Ferguson.
Just one last question here. Yesterday we touched on the fact that by raising the criteria, you're going to have more EL students there to attend to. But we also mentioned that the population of EL students in general is going to continue to increase. So in the back of my mind, I'm just worried about just the resourcing and what this may mean in terms of the volume of students needing these services.
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Well, it's more just expressing another concern that we did touch very briefly on the fact that the EL population is increasing, so it's kind of a double whammy. We're going to have more because we're raising the criteria, but more needing the service in general.
We're charged with federal statute that says we must make sure these students have access, full access to content. And they cannot have that without strong English skills in a state that's English only and in a country that's predominantly English speaking. So even if funding were the issue and there were no funding coming from Tennessee, and I applaud Tennessee, you've been very gracious, the state's been very gracious. But if there were no funding coming, these districts would have to find that funding on their own or they would be out of federal compliance. So I think that's an important consideration, and we work with districts, and if we find a district that's in short need, can't find a teacher, doesn't have the funds for that extra teacher they really need, but they're meeting growth and proficiency or they're coming close, we work with them on a waiver for a year to that staffing ratio to help them. I suspect that if this passes, we may see a little bit of that. But generally, our districts are doing a pretty good job.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Other comments?
Do you think we're going to be able to get all of this together between now and second reading if we do vote to approve first reading? Because I share Ms. Kim's dilemma on that. I mean, there's a lot we've asked you. There's a lot of, there's just a lot to do. When does second reading?
We're going to make this a very high priority, top priority, and we will see that we have gotten the things promised to you. And if it's appropriate, we'll work through Sarah or through Amy to reach out to you to see if you have everything you need when you've gone through the first and second round of materials. And if you need more, we'll do that. We can certainly get surveys out relatively quickly, and we can get those data together to discuss before second reading.
What are the implications of if the difference between approving on first reading or not approving on first reading?
Yeah, and either Jan or Katie maybe speak to this in terms of, I know you said you've been working for maybe 1 or 2 years now to bring something like this to the board. So talk to us about sort of the implications about why now, and if we didn't vote yes now, what that would mean, and sort of where we are in the timeline in terms of moving forward with a proposal like this.
If we pass on first reading now and can possibly get it passed on second reading, then that gives the districts a full year to get ready for this implementation, or it gives them time to get ready for this implementation. It would have given them more than a full year from the time we started the discussions. If we pass this on first reading in October and then on second reading in the spring, either we would have to put off the issues of exit, which are compliance issues, for 1 more year, or we would have to ask them to do it with the data that they're turning in at that time through their assessments. So we were trying to time this in a way so that it gave districts a little bit of time to really, they know it's coming, I believe, but implementing it's a different animal. And so we wanted to give them time for that. So it would cause an issue, but that's certainly not my decision.
Let me say a couple of comments. First, I share the same concerns that have been expressed here. I appreciate the information on the funding levels from the BEP. I was not aware of that. My inclination is that if we passed it on first reading, you would have until November to respond to us, which is 4 or 5 months. We still don't have to pass it on second reading if, in fact, the information is not provided to us to our satisfaction. And I do encourage you to get out and get the surveys and get the information. I am all for increasing rigor. I'm all for, as long as we're providing the services and as meaningful services, and the districts understand that, either they can provide that service in a separate classroom or in the inclusion in the classroom as it is. So I'd like to hear what the districts have to say. But if we pass it today on first reading, then I think, we can keep the schedule if possible, but we have to be satisfied in November.
I totally understand, and we will commit to that.
So as the person who is most often the one who disrupts things on second reading, I just want the record to be clear that passing on first reading is not saying okay, we're going to be good with this on second reading. I share Ms. Kim's struggle on this. I can say pass on first reading so we keep it on track, but there's a lot I want to see happen between now and second reading, or I'm going to be the person that is going to get the looks. Maybe not from the board. I don't mean from the board. Hopefully not from, you're here. But I just want it clear that this is not a wait, you didn't raise this at first reading because we're raising it.
Absolutely. And my understanding that's exactly why we have a first reading and a second reading. Just passing it on first reading does not mean an automatic pass on second reading.
I think
Amen.
I think we've done an adequate job of putting the department on notice.
So with that, are there any other questions? Do I have a motion then to accept on first reading the English as second language program policy as is, or is there a motion to amend it, or can I have a motion? I have a motion for Mr. Cobbins. Do I have a second?
Because of your question, I think it needs to be clear what he so moved.
He moved, good point. You are moving, as I understand it, to pass as stated English as second language, this policy as stated, with on first reading, with the understanding that they will come back to us at second reading and address the issues that were raised yesterday and today. How's that? Well, we have a second from Mr. Ferguson. Is there further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Opposed? Motion carries. Was that abstention? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, next item. Bid list of textbooks and instructional materials under official review. Ms. Roberta Mitchell. Robbie Grissom. Okay.
Good morning. My name is Robbie Mitchell, and my role at the Department of Education is Director of Instructional Materials. I'm here today to present to you Section E bid list for textbooks on first reading. The State Textbook and Instructional Materials Quality Commission, usually referred to as the Textbook Commission, has prepared a bid list of textbooks and instructional materials for Section E. You can see in your materials everything that's included in Section E. The most prominent list of items in that, of course, are our ELA materials, our reading and language arts materials. The commission, the Textbook Commission, has appointed an advisory panel consisting of 155 Tennessee educators to perform the formal evaluations of the books on this bid list and provide feedback to the commission for Section E. Those materials, as you know, are submitted for review now, and at the October the October meeting of the commission will determine which books and instructional materials to recommend to you, to the state board, for approval based on the recommendations of the advisory panel. The department recommends acceptance of this item on first reading. The state board staff concurs with the recommendation, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Any questions? Mr. Darnell?
Good morning.
Good morning.
First, I'd like to comment that English teachers across the state are rejoicing. I know it's been several years, since the last textbook adoption, and in a lot of cases for good reason, as the standards have changed. I guess the concern, I'm going to veer from English and go to math. I know there's been discussion, maybe even decisions that have been made to delay the adoption process for math. Can you speak to that?
I can. I'd like to qualify for you all that the textbook work has come to my team just recently, but I can speak to this for you. And if my answers are not satisfactory, my colleague Virginia Mayfield is our math coordinator, and she can speak to it as well. But since 2014, when the last time that math was involved, our adoption process has gotten a little bit off schedule, because the ideal schedule is that standards are approved, then books are bid, and books are created to align to those standards, and then books are adopted. With what we've been through in the last 5 years or so, with the one set of standards being changed to another set of standards, we had gotten a little bit off schedule there, and so math textbooks have been delayed so that math standards can be aligned. The adoption of math texts can be aligned to math standards.
And how much longer will that be? Is that 2 years from now, or?
It has been delayed 2 years, correct?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for going through that.
Thank you. And I can provide that in more detail, Mr. Darnell, if you prefer.
Mr. Edwards?
This is a general question. We adopt new textbooks to align with new standards. What happens to the old textbooks? Is there ever a sunset that they are no longer allowed to be used?
Mr. Edwards, I can't speak to that. I don't know if there is a sunset rule or policy, but I can find out for you.
It was interesting. I used to work with a lady who went to a smaller high school. Mm-hmm. And she was at the time, about 35, and her name was the first one written in the book with the date. And they've been using that same textbook ever since.
All that time?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I was kind of thinking, I just wonder whatever happened, if they keep them in use and what, anyway, I made the point.
Certainly, there is a clear point at which those books become out of alignment with the standards that are in place. But whether there is a rule or policy about that carries consequences about sunsetting use, I don't know, but I can certainly find out for you.
I have another question.
Uh-huh.
With regard to digital textbooks.
Yes, sir.
Where do we stand on that? I mean, I have a 5-year-old granddaughter getting ready to go to kindergarten here in another year, and I see these kids carry these backpacks weighing 30 and more than she weighs. And I was on the local board in Oak Ridge for several years, and we were moving toward digital textbooks, but what we found out is that the price wasn't any cheaper than the paperback books. Is there anything we're doing to encourage digital textbooks and encourage the publishers to make these more price competitive?
Well, let me tell you what I've been able to find out about that. Of course, in terms of what we're doing as a state about digital, as a state department, about digital textbooks, we all know, and I certainly am not telling you anything you don't know, when the choice of book, whether textbook or print, is a local decision, not a department decision. But what we are doing as a department is that we are reviewing all digital materials that are bid in exactly the same way that print materials are reviewed. What we also know, what we have learned is that what's happening now in most curriculum material decisions is that any curriculum that's adopted that is either purely digital or purely print are becoming more and more rare. Those are the outliers. Almost all curriculum material adoptions now are some blend of print and material together. And also we are learning, I learned in doing the research for this, is that almost all of our publishers, when a district purchases a print book, almost all publishers provide a digital license for that book, or it's not always a one-to-one that if you purchase one book you get one digital license, but many times if you purchase a set of books you get X number of digital licenses as well. So that is almost always available when it comes to purchasing digital versus print. What we find in comparison to cost is that if you ask publishers, they will tell you that digital is less expensive. That's the publisher's answer. I think you have to do your own research to see that. I mean, there are lots of different comparisons out there. You can, as with most things, you can find whichever answer you're looking for. What we have to remember, though, is that when you choose, if a district chooses a purely digital solution, that one of the things that comes with that, beyond the cost of the license for the digital resource, is the requirement of a one-to-one hardware solution in the district. Because in addition to having full Wi-Fi access for every student when they get home. So that's part of the cost that has to be remembered if a district chooses to go purely digitally. I hope that answers your question. If you have others, I'll be glad to look to see what I can find.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Mr. Edwards?
This, this is just a request. I would like for you to think through any policy or any thing that stands in the way of improvements that you would like to do, and not assume that because something exists in procurement, which would be on the state, or something that we have, or the department, that you ought to pursue trying to change it in order to make it better. It's sort of giving you permission to untie your hands.
Mr. Edwards, may I ask a clarifying question? Are you saying that specific to digital purchase?
No, ma'am, I'm saying in the entire, body of content of, if there's something you say, boy, I wish that didn't happen, because we could do,
Okay.
don't be inhibited about bringing that to us.
I'll certainly write that down, thank you.
We accept all opportunities for improvement.
That's wonderful. We like to hear your suggestions as well.
Any other questions? No questions? Do I have any action considered motion? Mr. Edwards moves as per what's stipulated in our book. No changes? And Mr. Darnell seconds. Any further discussion? No discussion. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Next, Ms. Virginia Mayfield on special course approval.
Good morning, Chairman Eby, State Board members. My name is Virginia Mayfield. I'm the Director of STEAM Content for the Tennessee Board of Education. As you know, State Board Rule 0520-01-03-052 and Policy 3.201 allow districts the ability to apply to offer special courses not listed in the State Board's approved high school course policy. The department receives applications, distributes those to review to the appropriate content specialists within the department, communicates back and forth with districts, and then makes a decision. Pretty much my department, we're the keeper of the process. I have some of the content specialists that work for me, but by no means all of them. Really what our review consists of are about three things. The first thing that we do is we check to see if there's actually a permanent course code already in existence that special content fits under, because then there's no need to create a special course code. Virtually all courses that are denied are in that bucket. So when you think about some of our foreign language courses that were denied, they were denied because there's already a permanent course code in place that can be used that's non-specific to the language. It's a general one that's used for all languages, and it's just helping districts see where those permanent courses are, that those fit underneath. Much like our Human Anatomy and Physiology 2, there was already a course code in existence where that course could fit. The benefit of a permanent course code is those count for graduation requirements for kids. So the reality is we want to make sure that we're setting up students the best opportunity that they can to get those graduation requirements, whereas special courses count as an elective credit for students. It's typically more beneficial for them to fit underneath that permanent course code umbrella. If there's not a permanent course in place, the second thing that we look for is to check to make sure that there's a rigorous set of standards that are being required for students to learn within that course, and that there's enough standards to cover the span of time that they're asking for the course for. If there's any questions on standards, the content specialists go back and forth with the districts to try to work that out. We're very proactive to try to make sure that the vast majority of courses, we work with districts to get courses that they want to offer kids. Because, really they give some very unique opportunities for students, and we want to make sure that Tennessee students have those opportunities. Ultimately, that's kind of the process that we go through, and then we communicate back and forth. The item we're presenting today is the 2019-20 academic year list for approval from the board. The Department of Education recommends acceptance of this item on first read. State board staff concurs with this recommendation, and I'd be very happy to take any questions that you have at this time.
Ms. Tucker.
I just want to make sure, so you said most of the languages fall under a more general, but I'm looking at, those were, Introduction to Spanish was approved. I would assume that there was a Spanish code already?
It was a it was a lead-in for those Spanish courses.
So there's not an intro to foreign language anywhere in the...
Not that I'm aware of. I can happily look and get back to you.
No, I'm not, because my questions before you spoke were around these MNPS courses that were denied, around Arabic, Kurdish, are those because there are already language courses that you can then teach Arabic under?
Correct. And then the kids get their graduation requirement for
Okay.
learning those languages. They meet the graduation policy for their foreign language requirements.
So
Yes,
the
ma'am.
denial here of Heritage Arabic 1, Heritage Arabic 2, Kurdish 1, Kurdish 2 does not mean students can't take those languages.
Absolutely
Okay,
correct.
That's what I was
It
trying to
means
make
that
sure.
they are taking them under a permanent course code instead of under a special course code, so they can get graduation requirements for those courses.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Edwards?
Boy, I ought to know these questions. Are these substitutes for other required courses?
No, sir, they're not.
These are electives?
Yes, sir, they are.
Yeah. When we look at the required courses and we hear about it all the time, that what our requirements are, and they're too tight, and how do you get through a school year? And we totally ignore phys ed, where we have a whole lot of people with diabetes and stuff, and that we've lost a whole generation of people who really are not really learning skills to stay in shape. And yet, I look through these, and they're all pretty fascinating courses. If I was pre-med and I had organic chemistry there, I would be. I don't understand how we're able to accommodate everything that we need or ought to be accommodating. That's not a question, it's more of a pontificating.
Thank you. I did have one question. I noticed human anatomy and physiology 2 was denied a special school district. And so I saw that there is a course, human anatomy and physiology 1. And so, why would we not offer 2, or why, can you help me out on why this one was denied?
There's a permanent course code for that one as well.
Okay.
So there's a permanent course code that Human Anatomy and Physiology 2 fits underneath.
Okay. And then going back to Mr. Edwards' comment, I think we are probably going to pass our master plan this afternoon, and one of those goals that we have in that master plan is relooking at graduation requirements, and that might be something that we might consider as we go through that process. Mr. Ferguson.
Just for clarification, there's a couple of items in here that have conditional approval. What is that?
The conditional approval was for the district to, most of the time, they're aligned to the wrong set of standards. For instance, if it's a science course and new science courses or new science standards came in during that particular, actually this year it would be social studies. So new social studies standards are in place. The district aligned to the wrong set of standards. They're good standards, they just need to be updated, and they're resubmitting those to us, and then they will be approved. So it's really something that it's a catch for the district. There's something they need to provide us. The course is great, but there's a technicality they need to update somewhere along the way so that then it can go to full approval.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
No other questions. We have a recommendation from the State Board as well as the Department of Education to accept on first reading the special course approval. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Ms. Tucker moved. Do I have a second? Mr. Edwards, second. Any further discussion? No discussion. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next is item D, Ms. Pat Connor on alternative education programs.
Good morning. I'm
Morning.
Pat Connor, Executive Director in the Whole Child Division and responsible for the Governor's ALTED, Alternative Education Advisory Group, and Alternative Education Programs in Tennessee. And this is my colleague, Christy Ballard, our General Counsel for the department. Today I come before you on an item to ensure compliance with Public Chapter 465, excuse me. This update adds the requirement that students in grades 7 through 12 who've been suspended or expelled must be assigned to an alternative school or program if there is space and staff available. Also, attendance in an alternative school or program shall be voluntary for students in grades 1 through 6 who have been suspended or expelled unless otherwise mandated by the local board. This is being proposed to be adopted as a policy instead of a rule.
Questions? Mr. Darnell.
Good morning. I have a couple things I'd like to ask. First of all, if we look at, let's see, this is 2A, where the policy changes. It says students in grades 7 through 12 who have been suspended or expelled must be assigned to an alternative school or alternative program if there is space and staff available. So I think there's some concern on the district level. First of all, what does an alternative program look like? Alternative school, we understand, but an alternative program, does that mean I hand a packet of work and say good luck for a week? Does that look like, some type of home visit? Does that, so I think the intent is to give flexibility, but also I think there's not clarity or guidance there as to what really is a alternative program.
Happy to be here to answer questions. I've gotten a lot of questions from districts, even school board attorneys, on the language of this law. So I'd like to provide some context and some history. The prior alternative school law, it defined alternative school as a setting for students who have been suspended or expelled from their regular program to be assigned there and continue to receive educational services, and their assignments and grades they earned would go back to the home school. That is still the case with the new law. Previous law stated that all school districts could have alternative schools available for kids in grades 1 through 6, but they had to have them available for 7 through 12. But the law did not mandate that any particular student be assigned to that alternative school. The major change to this law is if you are in grades 7 through 12, not only is alternative school mandatory and no longer voluntary for parents and students if assigned by school district, they have to be assigned for any period of suspension, a suspension for any reason. But it says alternative school or alternative program. A lot of school districts called and said, this is a problem for us because for short-term suspensions, we send a kid to ISS, which is at their home school. We don't want to send them across town to an alternative school. I believe that school districts can interpret this law more flexibly because alternative program in this law is not defined. And I think you have to look at the word an alternative to their regular classroom. But I think the intent of this law was that students who are being suspended for any amount of time continue to receive educational services. They continue to have an IEP implemented. The schools continue to generate funding. So I think sending a kid home and just saying keep up with your assignments would not meet the letter of the law. I think an in-school suspension class at a home school would be okay. I think behavior classes, I think because the department and school districts probably view alternative schools and alternative programs very specifically, alternative program as we look at it broadly is about coding and who gets a school number and how funding happens. But I think this law, for purposes of implementing it, is to be construed a little more flexibly. And ISS is perfectly appropriate for a kid who is receiving 1 day of suspension, and schools don't have to change that practice. Now, if schools have a practice, and as you can imagine, policies are all over the board across the state. Some school districts have policies that if you commit certain serious infractions, you're not eligible to be assigned to an alternative school. Well, this law will certainly change that. Some school districts have policies that, well, if it's just 1 or 2 days, we can send you home and you don't have to be served for that period. This will certainly change that practice because the intent behind this law is that all students being suspended continue to receive educational services in some setting that's an alternative to their regular school classroom.
I totally agree with that, because sadly, we know that there are probably some students who will do things to try to get out of school, to be home. I think learning needs to occur all of the time. What guidance will you all give to the districts as far as, is there a plan as far as, to give examples or go through that? Can you speak to that?
There is a current plan. In fact, I have a draft guidance memo that the department we're going to send out just to answer some of the many questions that we're getting from districts on how to implement this law. And a part of the guidance would be, people are asking, well, what does space and staff available mean? Well, it's not defined in the law, so I think each individual district will need to work with their local board attorney and come up with their own procedure and policy on, what space and staff available means. So that will be part of that guidance. But they all need to look at that and consider what that means and have a clear policy or procedure. So all of those types of things will go into that guidance memo.
Mr. Edwards?
That was one of my first questions, is if space and staff, that's pretty loosey-goosey. If I wanted to make a Dodge, I could say, oh shucks, we don't have the space or the staff. And that ends it, unless we've taken it further in policy. I've toured schools and gone into classrooms where or the kids who have been expelled or sidelined for whatever reason for however many days. And there ain't no IEP going on in there. I mean, they're sort of pretty much whiling away the hours until they get released. How do we enforce the intent for those kids?
One of the things that, thanks to the state board, a couple of years ago, you passed exemplary practices or the standards for alternative education. As a result of those standards, we at the department developed, or through the governor's ALTAD advisory board, developed alternative education exemplary practices recognition program. We currently have completed our second year. We have 7 schools from year 1 and 2 that have been identified as exemplary for alternative education. Our goal as ALTAD advisory board is to take these practices and those schools as models out this fall through focus groups with alternative educators around the state in our grand regions to promote those practices and what a quality alternative, a punitive alternative education program looks like. Because you're right, we're all over the board across the state with that. So our goal is to promote those practices within the districts, provide support for districts to implement those practices.
But we really don't have the resources to enforce it, really.
No, unfortunately.
Ms. Tucker?
That's going to lead me to, we do this, Mike. So is there any plan or is there capacity to audit how this is being implemented in districts? I mean, I see this whole annual survey piece, but an actual, not relying on districts to tell you.
So alternative schools are required to submit a school improvement plan, and through that we're able to audit to those plans to see if they're in compliance with the state standards.
Okay. I'm with Mr. Edwards. The language is very broad, and I think that's a statutory, and I think that's the statute. Is there a vision of going back and trying to clean up the statute in an upcoming legislative session?
I have heard that there is a plan to do that by outside entities. I do think that the Tennessee School Boards Association is contemplating maybe sample policies and procedures that school districts can use. But our memo will encourage districts to go ahead and have their own, because districts are different sizes, they have different resources, so I do think it's going to have to be a very personally tailored policy for their district.
Just remove that sentence.
I'd remove a lot of sentences. One of the, actually I'm a lawyer, I'd add sentences in, you know how that goes. One of the things I don't see that I would like to see is anything that, let me back up. So this is for students who have made bad choices, right? To say it nicely, right? If you're getting suspended or expelled, you've gotten yourself in trouble, right? What I would love to see here, I mean, I think there's an intent to keep the students in the education world, right? So they're not just going sitting at home. What I would love to see here is something that's tracking the why so that we can then circle back and like help fix the why. So in this like section G, the annual survey that has to go out, is there anything that prohibits us from including in that annual survey? I mean, you're talking about the programs, the number of students, the primary reasons that they're in the program. I mean, is there anything that primary reason for student assignment, I guess, could technically cover that, but something a little more holistic?
I will defer to Pat, but I believe under separate laws, we already track suspensions and reasons for suspensions and ultimate placement. But
Yeah, we send out an annual survey, and in that survey, we ask the number of students in each grade level that have been assigned. We ask for the reason for placement in that. So we do track that information about the why they are in there.
How about something in here about like any moves the district has made to address these primary reasons or something? I mean, just something where you're encouraging districts to think about reducing the behaviors that lead to the suspension.
So yes, we do ask what types of services and supports on that survey as well that you implement in your program to support students, whether it be some type of behavior modification program or whatever. So we do ask that question as well. I think another piece of legislation that's going to really help us this year is Public Chapter 421, which requires school districts to develop school discipline policies through a trauma-informed lens. And we've got the guidance developed for that right now that will hopefully in the next 2 to 3 weeks be releasing. So I think that's going to really help further this.
Ms. Tucker, later, if you want to make an amendment to the policy, feel free to do that, because I'm going to suggest one. As I read this, students in grades 7 through 12 who have been suspended or expelled must be assigned to an alternative school or alternative program if there's space available. There's nothing there about duration, and I was wondering how long, and you addressed it, Ms. Ballard, when you said it's for the termination, for the length of the suspension. So I'm going to move, when we have a motion, that we amend that to say assigned to an alternative school or alternative program for the duration of the suspension. So there's no question how long it should be. Is that any issue?
we would probably have to add a little caveat. There is another provision in the law that says if a student commits an infraction while they're in the alternative setting, they can be placed out of the alternative school for the rest of that suspension period. But it can extend the suspension period. So that's in the law, but we can.
Well, then let me ask you to get the right words, but I think in our policy,
be very
we need
clear.
to be clear how long this process, it's not for the rest of the school year, it's not, I think it's the intent is for the.
Yes, sir, we can certainly do that.
Mr. Cobbins.
What does the decision as to which option, whether it's program or alternative school, that lies with the school district itself?
It does. It's or in the law, and so it's discretionary on the part of the district. And it gives the district, because you can have a suspension for one day, but you could have a suspension for a calendar year or an expulsion if it's a zero tolerance offense. So they have to have some flexibility with regard to, what program is appropriate for the student.
Is there any space for parental input into which direction that goes for their child?
I don't think the law mandates that districts take that parental input into account, but I think most districts certainly, would hear the parents' suggestions. But I think at the end of the day, the law requires it to be a district decision.
Okay. I'm just reminded of a situation in Memphis several years ago where a parent appeared before the local board pleading with them not to send his son to an alternative school. He had gotten into an altercation, and his main point in our area, alternative schools are pretty rough places. He did not believe that his son was able to handle himself or navigate that environment by himself. And so my concern really is, if it's solely left up to the district without parental input, that could be somewhat problematic in instances like that.
I might add that for any suspensions or expulsions that are 10 days or more, students are afforded due process.
Okay.
And that's a student disciplinary hearing before a student disciplinary hearing authority. Most school districts have those, and the full board does not hear those. And that would be the time when a parent would definitely have input and could appeal a decision by principal to place them in the alternative setting. So, and they are required that hearing if it's a suspension that's more than 10 days. And so that would be for a lot of the serious infractions.
And so when the opinion of the parent and the district, even after this disciplinary due process occurs, if their opinions are divergent, how do we manage that?
When a student is expelled for 10 days or more, they're allowed a hearing before the Student Disciplinary Hearing Authority. And that, depending on the type of infraction, that body makes a decision. One, did the student commit the infraction? Because a lot of times the student says, well, it wasn't me, it was Johnny, or something like that. They have an argument, they didn't even commit the infraction. The second decision is what I like to call the sentencing phase of the hearing, where they determine, how long the suspension will be and where they will serve that suspension. Now, if it's a zero tolerance offense, and those are the three that are mandated in the law, and that is possession of drugs, a firearm, or aggravated assault of a staff member, including an SRO, the sentencing phase is already mandated in the law, and that's a mandatory calendar year expulsion that can only be changed by the director of schools, but the law does allow them to serve that expulsion in the alternative school. So that's kind of set in the law, but for all of the lesser offenses, that is something that hearing authority can consider. And the decision of the hearing authority can then be appealed to the full Board of Education. So there are a couple of opportunities to appeal decisions made at the local level.
I guess.
And then, of course, there's court beyond that.
And I guess where I am on that is in this instance that I described, I imagine that father had probably gone through this process that you described.
Maybe.
With the board being the final place that he could be heard.
Right.
And so again, when he's adamant he does not want his child subjected to this particular environment, how does that get managed? If a parent is adamant, I don't want my child to be placed in an alternative school environment for safety and other reasons.
After the board has made the final decision, there's always the opportunity to get an attorney and appeal that decision to a court. But beyond that, there are other educational options. A lot of parents choose to pull their child out of school and maybe homeschool them or enroll them in a private school. Those are the other options available.
All right.
Other questions, comments? So the department and state board have given us a recommendation. Is there any action on that? Motion to approve on first reading? Nobody wants to approve it? No motion? The chair will move then. I move that we accept it with the understanding that these changes will be looked at between first and second reading, specifically the length of the suspension. And then, did you have any changes you wanted, Ms. Tucker, considered?
I don't think I have any changes that would be just statutorily I'd be able to. I have plenty of changes I'd like to make, but nobody's elected me to the state legislature.
So the chair will make the motion. Is there a second? We have a motion and a second. Is there further discussion? No discussion. All in favor of accepting the motion with the recommendations, signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Abstaining, we have one abstention. Motion carries. Thank you. Next item, high school policy.
Hello again, my name is Aaliyah Guthrie. I'm the Director of Policy for the Department of Education. I'm here to present the High School Policy 2.103. The high school policy outlines the graduation requirements and other instructional requirements for high school students. TCA 496408 was amended this legislative session to require that students take and pass a civics test in order to graduate from high school. So we're proposing this language be added to the social studies course credit requirement on page 3 of the high school policy. Happy to take any questions.
Mr. Darnell.
Can you talk about how, I think the requirement now is 50 questions, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, I know that's a district level, probably teams that can go, how do most systems come up with that test? Is it pulled from the U.S. citizenship test? Is it developed, just kind of on standards based? How is that developed?
So the statute requires that the questions on the test be from the citizenship test that is given by at the federal level. So previously they had to give a 25-question test. So a district, and the statute also requires that the LEA prepare the test. So a district would pull 25. There are 3 different sections of the citizenship test. There's American history, American government, and civics. So they would pull questions from those different sections to a 25-question test that students had to take in order to graduate. But now that law passed in 2015. This requires that students take at some point during high school and pass with at least 70% correct. And then it stipulates the percentage, it stipulates the number of questions that have to come from each of those 3 sections of the citizenship test.
Thank you. That answers my question, because my worry was about quality, of course. And as a government teacher, I wholeheartedly support that, and hope that it will educate the public better on the workings of the government. Because one of the problems that we have in Tennessee, which is this hopefully will help, is our voting rate is atrocious. People who are involved in government are just is very low. So hopefully this is going to make a dent in that.
Mr. Edwards.
So I would like to amend this policy.
Okay.
And it's on page 12 of the regular version. In parentheses 3, into course exams, to add chemistry.
Say the page again, please.
All right, on page 12 of the, under 3, it says, end of course exams, end of course EOC examinations shall be administered in the following subjects: English, English 2, algebra, blah, 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 blah. I want to add back chemistry.
I'm trying not to laugh at you, Mike. I'm laughing with you, but I don't think we can do that in this way at this time. That was one that was removed last year after a series of discussions with the assessment task force.
Sadly, I was calling in on that trip from going over the mountains, and I was picking up about every 5th word, and when I got back, I said, we did what? So tell me why we can't.
And I'll look to you, Leah, for some assistance here. But in terms, there are a lot of decisions that go into, and cost, what tests will be administered statewide as part of the EOC program. I know there was a lot of conversation about chemistry and I think it was English 2 that were removed last year. I'm sure the department would be open to revisiting those conversations, but it would be a bigger implication in terms of cost, the administration of the test, just, I mean, there'd need to be more engagement, I think, before we could rightfully make that change. But that's one opinion. Leah, others, please weigh in.
I'll weigh in. I understand we've got to go through a process, and this can't be done overnight, with a stroke of a pen. But I do agree with Mr. Edwards that I think chemistry is something that we ought to look again to reinstitute the end-of-course exam.
I apologize, it was English 3, and I had concerns about removing both of those at the time, so.
And the
I'll
reason
have some
I
record about that,
understand that the end-of-course exam came out is because we no longer required an endorsed teacher or something like that in chemistry, wasn't that it, or something?
Well, whether that was why, that was the consequence of it.
but part of it was around the concern around so many tests in the 11th grade year. But again, if this is something the board would like to reconsider, I'm sure we can have further conversation and come back together. I just wanted to note that that would have
I would like,
widespread implications. I think we'd have to have more conversation.
well, rather than, I'm sure we're gonna have to have more conversation, but I would like the motion to be it occur with, no later than 2 years, and then they can come back and tell us, no, it's gonna take something in some biblical time frame, and we respond to that. Other than that, I'd like to see it back in 2 years, nothing takes 2 years, so.
I will certainly make a note, and Aaliyah, again, if you have anything else you want to add from the department side, we can come back to this offline and see what process we would even need to engage to bring that back before the board as a consideration. I need to find out more information.
So,
Well, if we amend it, then the information will be, how do we get this done in 2 years?
so something that Angie Sanders, your general counsel, just whispered in my ear was that it would need to change in the rule first. But I think there's also considerations about the administration and sort of the ramp up to making this kind of change. But certainly take the seriousness of your recommendation, and we'll communicate that to the commissioner, and take your timeline that you're requesting that this be a conversation that we revisit which end of course exams would be required.
Okay, so, not to be, I would like an appropriate amendment that will be binding, that will not be up to discretion. I think that in this, y'all can disagree, but I think, and I don't disagree that English 3 ought to be, I think that was a well-intended error. But I would like for the motion to carry the weight of this is going to happen. Now y'all figure out how to do it. And
As a member of the state board, you can make any motion you want to make. If there's a second and the board passes it, then it goes into the record.
okay, well, I would like to make the motion to add back chemistry and English 3. If it requires a rule change, then the motion is for us to proceed with a rule change at the earliest possible. And all of the administrative work that has to be done, including the working through the cost, with the end goal of getting these reinstated.
I think as pending the rule change needs to be in there first. And also some of the administrative, I think anytime there's a cost impact, you have to do an evaluation of the cost impact.
Right.
But we can certainly do all of that and report back to you at the next special called meeting in September. I mean, we can.
So we have a motion on the floor.
Yes.
Do we have a second to that motion?
I just need some clarification. Is the specific motion, because we have this policy in front of us on first reading, to add into that subsection 3, chemistry and English 3?
Yes.
Okay.
So-
English 3 as well? I thought
Yes.
you were just saying chemistry.
Yeah, that came.
Subject to the rule change. The rule change, according to Ms. Sanders, is the rule, we must change the rule before we can change the policy.
Right.
So, okay, so does the motion have to say subject to rule change, even if it's first reading, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
the way I see it is
I'm just
after
trying to
second,
clarify the record.
after second reading, then we schedule a rule change and start that process.
Yeah, I mean, nothing can formally happen until we change the rule. We can pass this motion.
Which requires us to start the rule
Ms.
change.
Sanderson.
Yes, I would just like to make the point with, if you all change something in the policy that is not then reflected, if it's in conflict with the rule, it wouldn't really have any effect. So I'm just wondering if it can just be a request that we bring you a rule at the next special called meeting, and that we have some additional conversations with the department, as Sarah was saying, around what the effect of that would be, what the fiscal impact would be. Because the policy, I know this is just first reading, but couldn't really be in conflict with the rule.
So, do we have, are we limited to request, or do we have the authority to direct?
We have the authority to direct.
That's my
I think it's a matter of sequencing and again, bringing the additional.
I get that. I
But yeah,
get
no,
that.
you can certainly direct in that
To
manner.
begin the rule change process. So ultimately, hopefully, to get chemistry and English 3 added back in with all of the hoops that's gonna have to be followed.
So can we do this as direction to the state board staff to bring back an evaluation of a rule change to include this by a special called meeting in September or something like that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, you've stated.
So by doing that, are you withdrawing your motion on this item and
What
providing
I'm
direction? Are you?
I get it. So, however we need to construct I want to begin the process of restoring those two courses, knowing that it requires first an amendment to the rule or changing the rule.
Okay, so would this work if we had a commitment from the state board staff that they will start working it under the guideline that within 2 years, if the board so deems that it would be in process, and not put it in as a motion, but take it as a commitment from our staff? Is that?
Yes, and I think maybe we would be best to say at the earliest possible next meeting. Again, I'm not sure, this is not something I was prepared to talk about today in terms of implications, just to be totally frank in terms of what we'll need to bring back to you, what it will take to bring this proposal to the board for first reading. So certainly September or November, we've got 2 upcoming fall meetings. We'll need to circle wagons with the department and see what our next steps include.
Okay.
Will that satisfy you, Ms.
Yes,
Rivers? So.
But I withdraw my motion.
Thank you. Withdraw and accept. Other questions?
Any other questions about the high school policy?
Hey, I do have.
You're doing well.
Something that leaped out at me. You know, I was. This is just editorial. I was in light of the graduation rates that I think we'll probably talk about later, compared to ACT scores, and really not in just the one county we were looking at, but all the way across the state. This has nothing to do, in fact, this is just the opposite of the spectrum, but move on when ready. If it applied to both ready to go to college and not ready to graduate, move on if and when you're ready. Because there's a problem there that we need to talk about later.
I understand what you're talking about there. Back to the change of policy to include the civics test. Are there any other comments or questions on that? Ms. Tucker?
I was gonna, because there's no way to follow that, I was gonna make a motion to approve on first reading if there weren't any other.
We have a motion to approve on first reading. Do we have a second? We have a second from Mr. Ferguson. Motion is made by Ms. Tucker. Any further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. And Mr. Edwards, we do appreciate your input very much so, and I think your thought process is something that we definitely need to consider.
Thank you.
Next item. Okay, next item is, where are we? Standards review policy, Ms. Owen.
Great. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. You'll have me for several of the next items here. The Standards Review Policy 3.209 lays out the board's process for reviewing all sets of academic standards every 6 years. As you may remember, in 2016, we reviewed ELA and math mid-cycle to move to Tennessee-specific academic standards. That caused a challenge that we discussed earlier where the textbook adoption cycle was no longer in sync with math and ELA standards adoption. This past legislative session, Public Chapter 270 allowed the board the one-time option to extend the typical 6-year review cycle for math and ELA standards. That's to allow us to work with the Department of Ed and the Textbook Instructional Materials Commission to realign standards review, textbook adoption, and educator training. This proposal is to modify the section on timing of standards review to include this newly allowable flexibility. Nothing else about the policy has changed, and all other aspects of the standards review process must comply with TCA 49.1.311 through 313.
Thank you. Are any questions for Ms. Owen? No questions. We have a recommendation from the State Board staff to accept this on first reading. Is there a motion? We have a motion from Mr. Edwards, a second. A second from Mr. Darnell. Further discussion? No discussion. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next item, Ms. Owen.
Thank you. The Uniform Grading Policy 3.301 sets out a number of requirements for state and local grading systems. The change today specifically pertains to local grading systems. All school districts are required to use the state uniform grading system, which puts Tennessee students on an even playing field for state scholarship opportunities. In addition, school districts may choose to adopt a local grading system for honors such as valedictorian or class rank that are specified at the district level. Previously, state law had a number of requirements for those local grading systems. For example, if you took an advanced placement course or a dual enrollment course, you received a specific additional bump to your GPA. This past legislative session, Public Chapter 248 removed those requirements for local grading systems. In accordance, we are striking our section on local grading systems from this policy and just making the statement that districts may have a local policy if they so choose. There are no further requirements for them in law, and so we are removing those requirements in policy.
Questions? I have one. So hypothetically, every student in a graduating class could be the valedictorian if the local district so stated?
It would be the decision of the local board.
Ah.
I will point out that it is currently, local boards have to follow some specific requirements, or they did before this law changed, but they could have their own additional requirements. I know of school systems that said, in addition to earning high grades, you also had to have a certain ACT score or participate in certain kinds of programs. So there's already variance between what local systems do here, but yes, it does open it up a good bit.
Okay. Any other questions? No questions. We have a recommendation from State Board staff to accept this on first reading. Do I have a motion? Motion by Mr. Ferguson. Do I have a second? Second by Ms. Tucker. Any further discussion? All in favor for accepting, say aye, please. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries. Now, the next items, H through M, we're going to take, they're all repeal, and they're going to take them together as part of consent.
Exactly.
Unless there's an objection. Okay?
I will quickly go through why each item is being proposed for repeal. The reasoning is a little bit different for each item, so please stop me if you have questions. For the first two items, the Early Childhood Education Plan Policy and the Principles of Quality Early Childhood Education Programs Policy. These are actually not listed on our website, but as part of our comprehensive rule and policy audit, we did find them in our archived digital files, and we wanted to go ahead and repeal them for the sake of transparency and making sure there's not any lingering requirements that we're not aware of. The state board proposed or adopted these policies in 2000, and it has not addressed them since then. These policies are now duplicative of existing rule and policy or rule and procedures. For example, the Department of Human Services has authority over non-public daycare and preschool facilities. The State Board Rule 0520-12-01 sets the standard for school-administered child care programs, and the Department of Education has the authority to monitor those programs. In terms of high standards, the State Board also approves the Tennessee Early Learning Development Standards for children ages birth through 5 years. So we felt like both of those were no longer relevant or timely and somewhat duplicative. Item 3J is to repeal the recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance policy. And I want to be clear here, we noticed this in our policy audit that state law TCA 4961001 requires the State Board of Education to develop guidelines on how the Pledge of Allegiance should be recited in public schools. Previously, we have published those guidelines as a policy, but in this process of truing up what we're required to do in law with what we actually have on the books, we realized it would be more appropriate to repeal this policy and issue the exact same document, copy, and move over to guidance. So when this item is on final reading for repeal in November, if you approve of it today, we will also bring you an item to approve that guidance. Item 3K is, again, to repeal a duplicative policy. This one is about the wellness requirement substitute, not taking away the option to have this substitution, which is that for students who take 2 courses of JROTC, those may substitute for the graduation requirement for lifetime wellness. Since that time, this was adopted in 1994, since that time our practice has been to include course substitutions in the minimum requirements for the approval of public schools rule, the high school policy, and or the Tennessee Department of Education's course code correlations database. The JROTC substitution is included in State Board rule and the course code correlations database. Therefore, the standalone policy is duplicative. 2 more. We are also proposing to repeal the Public Records Policy 1.500. In 2018, state law required every agency to promulgate rules regarding public records requests, which the State Board has done. Those rules are in promulgation, and they will have an effective date before next November when this policy would be repealed. As we now have a rule that is even more formal, up-to-date, and detailed, we're proposing to repeal this policy. Finally, my favorite one, repealing the Educational Television Rule 0520-08-01. You may or may not be aware that since 1974, the State Board could locate, establish, construct, and operate an education television and radio network. We are not in the business of doing so, as much as I would really like to have Nathan's voice running our radio station. This rule has not been updated since 1984, and the Public Chapter 248 of 2019 repealed the relevant state law, so we're proposing that we go ahead and repeal these rules. And I'm happy to take questions on any of those.
Any questions for Ms. Owen? Mr. Edwards?
In Knoxville, Fulton High School has a radio station. How does this impact that?
It does not. This would be one that was owned and operated by the State Board, and our staff is not prepared to do so.
In 1974, the State Board didn't exist, did it?
Neither did I, so.
Yeah.
Okay. Any further questions? Since it's been so ordered that we address each of these, H through M as a consent agenda, can I have a motion to accept them all on consent agenda? Mr. Edwards moves. Can I have a second? Second by Mr. Ferguson. Further discussion? No discussion. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Item N, Ms. Kendrick. Ms. Sanders. License denial, formal reprimand, suspension, or revocation policy.
Good morning, members. I'm Brittany Kendrick, Assistant General Counsel for Educator Discipline, and with me is our General Counsel, Andrew Sanders. Up first before you today is the license denial for formal reprimand, suspension, and revocation policy 5.501. This policy is hasn't been updated since 2012, and we are trying to make it more current with our current processes, along with the changes that we've made to our board rule 0520-02-03-0.09, which is on final reading today. We've gotten a lot of feedback from stakeholders about how to report, and it basically just governs our internal processes with respect to receiving the reports. So if you all have any questions, we're happy to take those.
Ms. Tucker.
Oh, we had this conversation on the call, but I just wanted to kind of put it on the record. One of the things that just got my attention and caused some concern for me in this policy was the part that says that if a director of schools, if a teacher who is disciplined, even if if the underlying action was founded, if they don't receive a certain level of discipline at the district level, there's no requirement for them to report that to us. And my concern that I expressed to you was you could have a superintendent who is desperate to have a teacher in a position, and a teacher does something really bad that we would take very seriously and potentially suspend or revoke a license, that if that superintendent was desperate enough, they could just keep it at a level where it never had to be reported to you. And that's a concern for me. However, you correctly pointed out to me that that is because of statute and that it's not anything that we have the power over. So I just kind of, because it's in our policy and I don't like it, I just wanted to kind of point out that it's something that if we had the power to change, I would be making a motion to change so that if someone committed a certain level of offense, regardless of what the superintendent did with that, that we would have the ability to take action.
Other questions or comments? We have a recommendation to accept on first reading this policy. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Ms. Tucker moves. Do I have a second? Mr. Edwards seconds. Any further discussion? No further discussion. All in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next item.
The next item before you is the license reinstatement and license restoration applications policy 5.500. Again, this policy has not been updated since 2015, and again, we wanted to make sure that it's updated with our current practices and how we process internally license restoration applications along with license reinstatement, and we also wanted to make sure that it was in line with our license discipline rule, which is on final reading today. I'm happy to take any questions if you all have any.
Any questions for Ms. Kendrick? No questions. We have a recommendation for acceptance on first reading this policy. Do I have a motion? Motion by Mr. Ferguson. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Darnell. Further discussion? No discussion. All in favor of accepting on first reading signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gaffey.
Good morning. My name is Allie Gaffey, and I'm the Deputy Director of Charter Schools for the State Board. On first reading today, I'm presenting an amendment to State Board Rule 0520-14-01. This amendment is in response to Public Chapter 219 of the 111th General Assembly, which now requires the State Board to set forth the timelines and appeal process for charter schools wishing to petition their authorizer for an amendment to their charter agreement. This new rule language sets forth the process for submitting an amendment petition for material modification of the original charter agreement. The rule specifically defines a material modification as a change in governance structure or the addition of or changes to the charter management organization, the addition or removal of a grade or grade levels, changes in student enrollment, the addition or removal of a plan to provide transportation, changes to the location if outside of the geographic area set forth in the charter agreement, changes to the school's academic focus, and changes identified in the charter agreement as material modifications or amendments. Additionally, the rule sets a timeline for submitting an amendment petition and outlines the process by which a charter school may appeal a decision by the authorizer to deny the amendment to the State Board. Prior to today's reading, State board staff gathered initial feedback from stakeholders, including authorizers and charter school operators, and will continue to solicit feedback through a rulemaking hearing on Monday, July 29th. That's Monday, right? And we anticipate making additional changes between first and final reading. State board staff recommends acceptance of this item on first reading, and happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Any questions for Ms. Gay? I just have one. So once we get to the Charter Commission board is set up, then these will all be readdressed at that point in time. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Further questions? We have a recommendation for a motion. Do I hear a motion on first reading? Mr. Edwards moves to approve. Can I have a second? Second by Mr. Cobbins. Further discussion? All in favor of accepting this on first reading signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. This finishes our first reading. I suggest that we take a break. It's 10:40. Let's reconvene at 10 minutes, 10:50. Okay? Thank you. reconvene, and we're ready to start the final reading items. First item is on the 2019-2020 State Board of Education Master Plan. Ms. Owen.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. TCA 491302 requires the State Board to develop and maintain a current master plan for the development of public education in kindergarten through grade 12. The State Board adopted a master plan in the 2015-16 school year that set both 5-year goals, and every year we update our annual policy priorities. This 2019-20 master plan presented on final reading maintains that focus on our 5-year goals while also including updates to key policy levers for the upcoming year based on member priorities that we gathered in a survey and in a feedback session from you all, as well as staff input. The master plan really helps guide our work as a staff to make sure we're meeting your needs and expectations as a board, and it provides coherence, alignment, and clarity for other state stakeholders on what the board is working toward each year. The State Board will engage in a comprehensive review of our progress toward those overarching 5-year goals during the 2019-20 school year and reset those goals for a new 5-year period beginning with the 2020 through 2021 school year. So I'm very pleased to answer any questions, and I'd also just like to say thank you. I know that you all have very busy and demanding day jobs, and you've taken all of our surveys and you've been in our focus group sessions and gone back and forth with me over email to develop this, and I just really appreciate the time and investment that you've shown in it.
Thank you. Yes, Ms. Tucker.
So I don't have a question or a problem with the report or anything. I just want to talk a little bit about the focus that we have in it on teacher diversity. And I have a group of fellows who worked on this issue, and so just to sort of set that context, I want to throw out some data points that they gave me on teacher diversity in Tennessee, just to highlight the importance of us focusing on that work in our master plan and our work. So 95%, half of Tennessee's public school districts has a teacher workforce that is at least 95% white. Half. 40 of our 140 districts has no African American teacher in the entire district. 50 of our districts have no Hispanic teachers, Latino teachers in the district. 87% of our public school teachers are white, which obviously is disproportionate to the increasing diversity in our state. And so I just wanted to highlight those things to say that I think we really need to figure out how we can pull that lever on diversity. We have the statute that talks about us adopting a policy that the commissioner recommends on diversity. And my brilliant fellows have talked about having in that policy, having a set percentage as a goal, like we will increase diversity in Tennessee teacher force by X% by X year, so that it's a measurable goal. And so I would just like to just highlight that work that they did and encourage us as a board. It talks about using policy levers and working with our partners to try to really attack that. Everybody knows what the data is around diverse teachers and what they mean for students in a classroom, both culturally and also academic performance. So I just wanted to make sure that there's a lot we want to work on. I wanted to make sure that we didn't lose that piece of it in the conversation.
Absolutely. I look forward to reading that research. And that state statute was just updated this year. Previously referred to the recruitment, retention, and employment of African American teachers only, which is an admirable goal, but we're also looking to expand diversity in other ways in Tennessee. And in accordance with that change in the law, we'll be updating our rule that currently references only African American teachers as well.
Thank you. I think that the master plan is one of the most important things we do. I remember an old boss once told me, he says, if you don't know where you're going, you're never lost. And so I look toward this. I look forward how we continue to track this. Look at it. I just had, one of our basic achievement goals is, our main student achievements is those 3 items. Where do we stand right now on those items?
Sure.
As we look forward?
So the items that our Vice Chairman is referring to is reaching the top half of states on NAEP, or the Nation's Report Card, having all students average an ACT score of at least a 21, and having at least half of the graduating class of 2020 earn some kind of post-secondary degree or credential. I can give you updates. In 2017, which is the most recent NAEP administration for which we have data, we should get the 2019 data in the coming months. For reading, we were number 34 out of 50 states in 4th grade and number 38 in 8th grade. For math, we were number 34 in 4th grade and number 35 in 8th grade. For science, we were number 19 in 4th grade and number 21 in 8th grade. So for the science, we did actually break into the top half of states, which is very exciting. But for reading and math, we certainly have some room to go.
Can we, in the future, sort of see that on a graph year by year?
Absolutely.
Let us know how we're tracking to.
You got it. For the ACT, in the fall of 2018, which is when the department releases state level data, the average state ACT score was a 20.2, which has risen in recent years. It is hard to move the needle on ACT scores, and we continue to make incremental progress as a state. Our last
And
goal,
I think another thing that's important on that is the percentage of students that we have that take the ACT.
Correct. We are one of several states that require all students to take the ACT, and we've actually seen more and more of our students, particularly students with disabilities, taking the ACT with accommodations that are appropriate than we have in the past. So the score is rising even as we have more and more students taking the assessment. Finally, for our post-secondary attainment, the class of 2020 has not yet graduated from high school, so we can't track them directly. It's also quite a lagged measure. We give them 6 years to complete a 4-year degree. So the Higher Education Commission does a 6-year study from when you graduate high school to what kind of credential you've earned. But there are some leading indicators of progress. THEC has closely been examining students who receive the Tennessee Promise Scholarship Program. And we have seen increases in percentage points of students who are completing technical or community college if they pursue that scholarship program.
Thank you. And like I say, I would just like to get regular updates on this. Mr. Edwards.
Yeah, one of the things that we may, if y'all could think of other metrics that would be more current. I think these are really good, except there's such a lead time, it's hard to figure out what our trajectory is. That, not only that, you kind of always want to shoot for a level, and once you attain that, shoot for a higher level. So we would like to, the notion that we'd be in the top half really ought to embarrass us. I mean, you know, if we're in the top half of the SEC football, they'd have us. But being in the 30s is really, really good. I want to shoot for the best, and if we miss it, we'd come closer than trying to be higher than in the top 50%. Anyway, some way that we can track our trajectory, and ACTs is probably one. The thing that I can't square is we have some extremely high graduation rates. They don't really line up with a lot of the other metrics that we have. Part of what the sinister part of me is that because schools are graded on graduation rates, that's one thing that they can control, and therefore it is easy to inflate them. Now, that will probably just send a lot of schools into a tizz for me to say that, but nevertheless, if it isn't that, I'd like to hear an explanation of how there can be such a discrepancy between graduation rates and people walking across the stage, getting a high school diploma, and not being able to read adequately when they get to post-secondary.
I think one thing that will help this conversation is when we are able to delve into the accountability model with the Department of Education and learn more about what's encompassed in the Ready Graduate Indicator, because that does include ACT score and taking early post-secondary options. So those are things that are tracked for schools as well, and that I know schools are eager to increase their percentage of having ready graduates. So that'll be a great conversation in the future.
I look forward to it.
One other comment on that too. I mean, this is the 1920 master plan, but we fully, and I think we've shared this with the board, you know, we'll plan to reset our student achievement goals. We set these back in, I believe, 2014, 2015. So it's time to look again at sort of the next year, 5-year horizon and determine what do we want to anchor our policy work in terms of that North Star of student achievement. So I do think we can reflect on both the lagging nature of the post-secondary goal that we're currently working towards and also think about, you know, where we need to be on these other metrics as well. So we'll have a lot more conversation as we think about the 2020, 2021 master plan on all these fronts.
Mr. Eby mentioned that, you know, the ACT score is going up despite the fact that we require all students to take it. But I know this board remembers that despite statutorily requiring all students to take it, districts were not necessarily following that. And now we move that into state board rule as a graduation requirement. Is that actually in? I mean, there was a 2-year onboarding for that. So I'm curious if that's actually in place now.
It is. It's in place, and we have a frequently asked questions document that we worked on with the Department of Ed to answer questions about high school graduation and grading practices. We get so many questions from districts about the ACT requirement to make sure that they are in compliance. If they have, you know, student in this unique scenario, at what point should they test? What's the best thing for them to meet this requirement? So districts are really eager to meet this.
Sure they are, because that does affect the graduation requirement now.
Yes, Mr. Cobbins.
Just circling back to the diversity item and Ms. Tucker's comments, I recalled earlier this year reading an article about the Tennessee Educators of Color Alliance, and they held a conference at Tennessee State with the goal of establishing a statewide organization to help achieve some increased diversity. And so if we have a relationship with them, it might be good to connect and see how their goals align with ours and if there's opportunity for collaboration.
I would love to. I know several of us on staff have personal and professional relationships with those folks, so very happy to do that.
You know, yesterday we had that, Tuesday we had the Ed Prep Provider Advisory Council, and we talked about it yesterday, the shortage that we have in quality teachers across the state. And this is something that I think we all say we've got to continually really focus on to meet the diversity needs as well as meet all the needs of shortage of teachers. And this is something I think needs to be focused on in the coming year. I'll also say this is that I think the local education authorities, local boards have a requirement to have their own 5-year plans. And I would encourage each of those to look at the master plan that the state board has and use that to model and put those their local plans consistent with the state board's plan.
Great.
One of the things that worries me is that there's a lot of conversation about the need to become more diverse and more a faculty that looks like the student body, a mirror of that. And when it's discussed, there's a sense that, well, yeah, that's hard. How are we going to do that? How would you, you know, and the truth is, yeah, it's hard, and we're going to have to figure out how to do it. It's not something that we can just say, well, you know,
Handle it.
we're going to have to do it. And a lot of people's going to have to do it and get smart about it. The other thing is, part of that recruitment mix needs to be males, particularly African-American males. It's so important in the classroom. Yeah.
Certainly.
Any other questions or comments? So we have a recommendation to pass on final reading our master plan. Do I have a motion?
So
moved. I have a motion by Mr. Cobbins. Do I have a second to that?
Second.
Second by Mr. Edwards. Further discussion? No discussion. All in favor of accepting our 2019-2020 master plan signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Owen. Next is Tennessee School Bus Specification Policy. Tammy Knipp.
Good morning. My name is Tammy Knipp. I'm the Director of the Student Transportation. This morning I'm presenting Policy 2.400, Tennessee School Bus and Specifications. The purpose of this is to align our current industry standards to increase the safety of school bus drivers and students by adding bus specifications for vehicles that were built after July 1st, 2019. And these specifications are in accordance with the National School Transportation and Procedures Manual adopted by the 16th National Congress on School Transportation, last updated in 2012. So the department recommends acceptance approval of this item on the final reading. The SBE staff concurs, and I'm happy to take any questions. There have been no changes made since we last met.
Any questions for Ms. Knipp? No questions. We have a recommendation. Do I have a motion? Motion by Ms. Tucker and a second. Second by Mr. Commons. Further discussion? No discussions. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item, Category 2 non-public school accrediting agencies.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the board. I am here presenting the Category 2 non-public school accrediting agencies. My name is Katie Poulos. I'm the Chief Schools Officer for the state of Tennessee. This item was heard in May, and there was the recommendation to approve 8 applicants. Those were listed in your material. 9 had applied. One of those applicants who applied, the Classical Latin School Association, had been given notice by Marcy Tidwell that their application did not adequately demonstrate that they were addressing all of the requirements of a Category 2 school. She gave that notification to them on March 11th, asked them to respond by March 22nd with additional information to demonstrate that that accrediting entity was ready to meet the requirements of this board, and there was no response. And so the recommendation to not approve that is based on the fact that they did not respond to that request for additional information.
We have a recommendation on final reading. Is there questions?
I have a question. How does this intersect with the education savings accounts law that just got passed? Are these are groups that can approve schools that would then be able to be in that program as Category 2 schools?
Category 2 schools would be able to participate in the ESA program, and these entities are approved by this board. Then they are the ones that are able to approve and then monitor those schools.
Thank you.
Further questions? No questions. Do I have a motion to accept on final reading? Motion made by Mr. Ferguson. Do we have a second? Second by Ms. Kim. Further discussion? This is a rule, so it will require a roll call vote. Mr. Griffith?
Mr. Cobbins. Mr. Darnell. Mr. Evie.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards. Mr. Ferguson. Ms. Kim. Ms. Tucker? Aye. Mr. Chairman, you have 7 ayes, 0 noes.
The motion then passes on final reading. Thank you. Next item is individualized education accounts.
Chairman, members of the board, again, I'm presenting the individualized education accounts rule 520-0111. This presentation is simply some updates to the rule to clarify, to ensure that it's consistent with the law, specifically in regards to account holder agreements, criminal background checks, student eligibility, and approved uses of funds. Since the first reading, the definition of physician has been updated to include additional therapist license types that are found in Title 63, and those items are redlined on page 4 of the proposed rules. Previously, the definition included only, I believe, osteopathic doctors and medicine and surgery doctors, physicians, and it's a much more robust list at this time. And the intent of that is that the students that are participating in this program typically have a wide variety of needs and have a wide variety of medical care individuals that are serving them, and we wanted to ensure that this was as inclusive as possible.
Questions? Yes, Ms. Tucker.
I have a question. I know that Rebecca Wright was managing this program, and I understand she's no longer with the department. Is there somebody else in place managing the program yet?
The team members have stepped up. We are working continuously to try and identify the right person to fill that role. It is quite difficult, but we are interviewing quite a bit. We have identified one candidate who will be an assistant commissioner that will sit over the role, and over the work, but still working to identify the right person.
Okay. The reason I asked, it wasn't just to be nosy. I've been very engaged on this rule as it has developed, and to sort of, for my own purposes, I went through the application process just to see what it would feel like as a parent, and I noticed some issues that I just want to have a conversation with somebody in the department about, and it may be a legislative issue, but when there are questions about why the numbers are low in the program, I think I may have found a sort of a gap in coverage. So I just wanted to figure out who I should speak to about that.
Member Tucker, you can certainly reach out to me, and we are quite aware that there are some changes that are needed to ensure that it's more accessible to families, and so happy to work with you on that.
Awesome, thank you.
Further questions? So we have a recommendation from the Department of Education and furthered by the State Board staff. Do we have a motion to accept this on final reading? Motion made by Ms. Tucker. Do I have a second? Second by Ms. Kim. Further discussion? Again, this is a rule, so it will require a roll call vote. Mr. Griffin?
Mr. Cobbins? Mr. Darnell? Mr. Eby?
Aye.
Mr. Edwards? Mr. Ferguson? Ms. Kim? Ms. Tucker? Mr. Chairman, you have 7 ayes, 0 nays.
Motion passes. Thank you. Next is education prep policy. Mr. Donaldson. Oh, Ms. Fiveash. Oh, Mr. Donaldson, both.
Yes. Good morning, State Board of Education members and Executive Director Morrison. David Donaldson, Assistant Commissioner of Human Capital.
Elizabeth Fiveash, Assistant Commissioner for Policy and Legislation.
And we are here to present the Educator Preparation Policy for final reading. This policy aligns with the new Educator Preparation Rule the board recently approved. Specifically, the policy updates language regarding the expectation for RTI training, response to instruction and intervention training, the requirements for annual reports for instructional leader preparation programs, and clarifies the expectations for clinical practice for job-embedded candidates. There have not been any changes made since first reading, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Are there any questions? No questions. We have a recommendation to approve on final reading education preparation policy. Do I have a motion? Mr. Darnell so moves. Do I have a second? Second by Ms. Kim. Further discussion? This is not a roll call, so we take a vote by voice. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Middle grade policy.
Hello, my name is Aaliyah Guthrie. I'm the Director of Policy for the Department of Education, and I'm presenting today on the middle grades policy 2.102. This item, we're proposing changes to clarify that students who successfully complete coursework prior to 9th grade should receive full credit for that coursework. This was brought to you on first reading in May, and there's been no changes.
Any questions for Ms. Guthrie? No questions. We have a recommendation from the Department of Education and the State Board staff to accept this final reading on middle grade policy. Do I have a motion? Mr. Cobbins moves. Do I have a second? And Mr. Ferguson seconds. Further discussion? No discussion. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
I just wanted to add that in October of 2018, we started working on this middle grades policy, and there was a lot of conversation before that. So we've been working for more than a year to update it, and so now that it's passed on final read, it's a job well done. Thank you.
And well done by the department. Thank you. Stovall.
Good morning, Tess Stovall, Director of Charter Schools for the State Board of Education. The first item I have for you is item G, which is Charter School Revocation Policy 6.110. This policy is presented on final reading to include updates that were passed by the 111th General Assembly. And since first reading, there have been no changes, and I am happy to take any questions.
I do have a question, as we talked about yesterday in the one-on-one. If you look at that policy, two sections. One is appealing a local board revocation, and second is state board as authorizer. Since the first part of the policy is appeal, I would like to move to change the title of that policy from charter school revocation to charter school revocation and revocation repeal, as we had discussed.
Yes.
Others, because I think that makes it more descriptive of what we're talking about there. It'll be easier for people to find.
Absolutely.
So, can I have a unanimous consent to accept that change? Okay. Without objection, so ordered. All right. We have a recommendation then to accept this final reading as amended. We don't have to vote on the amendment since it was accepted. All in favor for accepting this on final reading signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next time.
Thank you. Item H is Charter School Intervention Policy 6.700. Again, this policy was updated based on changes that were passed in the 111th General Assembly. This policy in particular guides the state board's work when it comes to intervention or corrective action with our authorized charter schools. And since first reading, there have been no changes, and I am happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Stovall? No questions. We have a motion by Mr. Edwards to approve the policy. Do I have a second? Second. Further discussion? No discussion. All in favor of accepting this on final reading signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next item.
Thank you. Item I is Charter School Renewal Policy 6.800. Again, this is update to this policy based on changes from the 111th General Assembly. And since first reading, there have been no changes, and I'm happy to take questions.
Just like we made the change on G, Ms. Stovall and I have talked, and again, the beginning of this one is renewal applications also, so I'd like to change that title to Charter School Renewal Policy, Renewal and Renewal Appeal Policy. If there's no objection to that, we'll have consent. No objection, then consent so ordered. Further questions?
I'm always happy to take questions. But.
So the policy is accepted, is being presented as amended. We have a motion for that. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Cobbins. Motion is by Mr. Edwards. Sorry. Further discussion? No discussion. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Nay? Any nays? Motion carried. Thank you.
Thank you. Item J is an update to the Charter School Appeals Rule, and this was presented to you on first reading in February. We held off bringing this to you all in May because we wanted to ensure that we could include any changes that came from the 111th General Assembly. So the vast majority of changes that you'll see between first and final reading are to align the rule with the changes in statute. You'll also see some clarification in the language as we wanted to be clear about the roles and responsibilities in an appeal what the state board members are charged with versus what is happening in the appeal process from the state board staff. Most of this language aligns with and is already contained in policy, in the policies that you all just approved, as well as our appeals policy, and this is a part of our process to move what's currently in policy and formalize it into a rule. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Ms. Tucker?
I don't have any questions, but because I've been unusually silent on all these charter things, I just wanted to note that I did have questions on our one-on-one call, and Ms. Stovall, as always, answered them very well. So great work.
Thank you.
As always, you and your team put a lot into creating this entire district, and we really appreciate the work that you've done.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? We have a recommendation. This is a rule, which we'll recall a roll call vote. If we have a motion, do we have a motion to accept the final rule? Motion by Mr. Ferguson. Do we have a second? Second by Ms. Tucker. Any further discussion? If none, then I'll ask Mr. Griffin to call the roll, please.
Mr. Cobbins. Mr. Darnell. Mr. Eby.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards. Mr. Ferguson. Ms. Kim. Ms. Tucker. Mr. Chairman, you have 7 ayes, 0 nays.
Motion then passes on final reading. Next item. Educator licensure denial, formal reprimand, suspension, and revocation rule, also a rule.
Good morning again, members. Brittany Kendrick, Assistant General Counsel for Educator Discipline, along with Angie Sanders, our General Counsel. We are presenting the Educator License Discipline, Formal Reprimand, Suspension, and Revocation Rule on final reading. Since first reading, we've had a rulemaking hearing where we got a lot of feedback from our school districts. We've spoken at a Tennessee School Board Association meeting where we got feedback from them, and we also had one-on-one feedback from the Tennessee Educators Association as well. We've also made some changes to the rules since first reading, including the definition of sexual misconduct under the definition of inappropriate communication, added to the definition of dismissal to include non-renewal. We've created a more comprehensive definition for test security breaches by making it more aligned with the state law with respect to TCAP security guidelines. We've given more examples with respect to the definition for negligence, added failure to report by school directors to the actual mechanism for which you all can take action for reprimand or suspension or revocation of a school superintendent's or director of school's license for failure to report. We've cleaned up the automatic revocation offenses to make it more in line with law, expanded the felony conviction range for which you all could take action, and just made it a lot more clear with respect to the structure for educators with respect to how their license will be reviewed when they get reported by the school districts. But I'm happy to take any questions if you all have any at this time.
Questions for Ms. Kendrick? Let me just thank you for going out and getting that, searching that feedback. It's very important that we take the time to do that, and I applaud you for doing that. We have no questions. Do I have a motion to accept this on final reading? Mr. Edwards moves. Do I have a second? Second by Ms. Tucker. This is a rule change, so it will require a roll call vote. Mr. Griffin?
Mr. Cobbins. Mr. Darnell. Mr. Eby.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards. Mr. Ferguson. Ms. Kim. Ms. Tucker. Mr. Chair, you have 7 ayes, 0 nays.
Thank you.
Motion passes on final reading. Thank you. Next item, basic education program allocations.
Good morning. My name is Mary Ann Dursky. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Local Finance at the Tennessee Department of Education. I'm here to bring to you this morning for your final approval the BEP allocations for school year 2019-2020. The total allocations to districts total $4,844,413,000. And I believe you have a copy of the LEA by LEA distribution before you. The Department of Education recommends approval and the State Board of Education concurs. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. I will first note that we do have a letter of necessity from the commissioner, result because us just receiving this at, I think 4 days ago or something. So that has been received. Are there questions? I'm sure the districts are looking forward to it. So let me ask if we have a motion then to accept BEP allocations. Motion by Mr. Edwards. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Ferguson. Further discussion? No discussion. This is, this require a roll call vote? Just a voice vote. All in favor of accepting the BEP allocation signify by saying aye. Aye. Any nays? Motion carries. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Next item. Course Access Program Rule.
My name is Aaliyah Guthrie, and I'm the Director of Policy for the department. I'm here to present the Course Access Program Rule on final reading. The Course Access Program gives students across the state access to certain course access courses that they may not otherwise have access to at their school. So this was originally passed in 2016, then amended in 2018, and was then amended again in 2019. So this item was actually heard on final reading in May of 2019 by the board, but it's back today to incorporate the changes that were made during the 2019 legislative session. Those changes are to clarify that students are entitled to 2 courses per year rather than 2 courses total. And those changes are on page 2 and page 6.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Guthrie? If we have no questions, do I have a motion to accept this rule on final reading? Mr. Darnell moves. Do we have a second? Second. Ms. Tucker seconded. And because this is a rule, Mr. Griffin, you want a roll call vote, please?
Mr. Cobbins. Mr. Darnell. Mr. Evie.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards. Mr. Ferguson. Ms. Kim. Ms. Tucker. Mr. Chair, you have 7 ayes, 0 nays.
Motion passes on final reading. Thank you, Ms. Guthrie.
Thank you.
Next item, Charter School Education Agency. Ms. Stovall.
Hi, my name is Tess Stovall. I'm Director of Charter Schools for the State Board of Education. These policies that we have for you on first and final reading today are a part of the LEA policies and procedures that we as a district are required to adopt and govern the State Board's functions as an LEA. We brought to you in May a part of our annual policy audit, a significant number of updates for our policies. These policies you see before you today are based on changes that we saw in the 2019 legislative session. And the reason they're on first and final reading is because we want to make sure we're be able to quickly communicate to our charter schools final revised policies in advance of the school year. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Stovall? No questions. This is a policy. Do I have a motion to accept the recommended policy? Ms. Tucker made the motion to approve. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Ferguson. Any further discussion? No discussion. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Next item, education preparation providers and special area programs. Mr. Donaldson.
Good morning again, State Board of Education members and Executive Director Morrison. David Allenson, Assistant Commissioner of Human Capital. We're presenting 2 current educator preparation providers for ongoing approval and are presenting 1 new educator preparation provider for initial approval. We will begin with the recommendations for Tennessee Technological University and Aquinas. TTU participated in a joint CAPE and state review during the spring of 2018. The review team concluded that the EPP, the education preparation provider, met all CAPE standards with no critical deficiencies. Although there were areas for improvement identified on 2 standards which must be addressed during the next review, and no stipulations were cited on the specialty area programs, the SAP, the SAP review. The recommendation for this provider and the 30 specialty area programs is for full approval. Now, Aquinas College participated in a state-only review during the spring of 2018 as well. The review team concluded that the EPP met expectations on the CAPE standards, but areas for improvement were identified on 3 standards and minor stipulations were identified on the SAP review. The recommendation for this provider in the 17 specialty area programs is for full approval, but with minor stipulations. If approved with minor stipulations, the EPP, the Education Preparation Provider, will submit a plan for addressing the areas in need of improvement to the department within 3 months. The department will monitor the Education Preparation Provider's progress on the plan, and if the department determines the areas in need of improvement have been adequately addressed, then the State Board of Education may approve removal of the minor stipulations. I'm going to pause there to see if there's any questions on Tennessee Technological.
Mr. Edwards.
On Tennessee Tech, you said that there were some areas that need to be improved and they must be addressed before the next review. What is the time frame for the next review?
It is my understanding that we do annual reports, but then there's the comprehensive one, which is every 7 years.
Yeah, so my question is, are we looking at the next review being 7 years, or for these that need to be addressed, must be addressed 1 year?
So with I know your question's about Tennessee Technological. With Aquinas, that's the one they're going to have to submit a report within 3 months. My understanding of our current process is it would be something we could factor in as part of the annual report, just as supplemental. But I believe normally it's part of the full 7-year process.
Well, if you go back and restate what you said about there are some areas that must be addressed and be addressed before the next review, sounded like there was some level of urgency that ought to occur rather than the 7-year.
I think, yeah, no problem. I would say, based on my review of these items, I don't know if I'd use the word urgency in this case, but it is something that we take seriously and want to see improvements upon. There's nothing in here that raises to a level of attention where we would not recommend for approval. And I think with the annual report is a good chance, which is that it would be done in a year, to see if improvements have been made.
Can you give us some examples of the things that you're looking for improvement?
Yeah, so in this case with Tennessee Tech, it was the design of clinical experiences are not clearly linked to ensure impact on students of colors and English language learners. So one of the things that I'm actually really excited about is something that you passed earlier today was part of the update to the Educator Preparation Rule 5.504 includes that you must have a minimum of 2 placements during clinical mentoring. I think that is one big step that we're excited to see all universities implementing, which would then ensure more diverse placements of that experience. So that would be one example. And so if you think that this was a review that took place over a year ago, and with this rule now becoming law, it allows for steps to already be taking place, hence why we believe we would see changes within the annual report, I would say.
Further questions?
Oh, and due to great expertise in council, this review was done prior to the new rule. So thus, with this new rule, it will force changes to be made, which is good.
But not within, shorter than 7 years? Will the new rule require it to be changed shorter than 7 years? We've got to wait 7 years before.
Elizabeth Favesh. So no, these items would be addressed differently under the new rule that you all have passed, but these programs were reviewed under the old rule. So we are making a recommendation in line with that old rule. As David mentioned, there are opportunities to look at the data through the annual report process, but another comprehensive review would not happen until 7 years. But again, as we are now reviewing and approving programs under the new rule, there is more rigor and more opportunity for engagement before that 7-year process.
I would encourage you not to wait 7 years.
Message received.
Other questions or comments? We have a recommendation to accept this rule on final reading. Do I have a motion? Oh, I'm sorry.
There's 3 parts to it.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You just went through it first. I'm sorry. Apologies. Go ahead.
And then lastly, I'm excited to present on Rutherford County Schools for initial approval as an educator preparation program. During the 17-18 academic year, Rutherford County Schools expressed interest in pursuing approval to operate as a EPP to recruit and prepare through an occupational educator specialty area program individuals to teach CTE occupational courses. We have provided you with background on how Rutherford County Schools was able to utilize the EPIC grant, which is Experienced Professionals in Classrooms grant, to pursue approval as a EPP. Additionally, department staff from the CCTE team, College and Career Tech team, worked closely with Rutherford County to help them through the approval process. If approved, Rutherford County would become the first Tennessee school district approved as an EPP and will hopefully serve as a model for other districts across the state. Again, this recommendation for Rutherford County Schools and the 24 occupational SAP special area programs is for initial approval. I can just say, now that I'm not reading from a script, I'm really excited by this one. This is just a great first start at doing this work. One other thing that's not included in here, it actually will allow for other counties to send teachers through as well. If this gets approved, I know Wilson County is planning on sending one individual. The cost is also just really, really affordable for those that are in district. It costs them only $200 to go through this via job embedded placement, so they're getting paid as teachers while only minimal cost out of pocket, and for out of county $500 based on this first cohort. We're looking at about 10 to 15 people that will be in this cohort, but I just think this is a great move, and for being new on all of this, this is something that when I heard about this, I was like, this is great to walk into. So I enthusiastically hope you all think that too.
Comments or questions? Let me ask one question. Did they go through the same rigor and review as?
Yeah, great question. So they had to follow the typical EPP approval process to be recommended to you all when they had submitted an initial proposal after working with teams in CCTE office as well as the team that I oversee. They had to be given feedback, had to make adjustments. I think what's really great from the U.S. Department of Ed via this EPIC grant is it allows for, with this case with Rutherford, to hire somebody that worked on this process, coordinated internally with the district. I'm just really a big fan of working with districts around their internal capacity. I think the answer is always in the room, and the more we listen to districts, the better ideas we get. And so talk about leading by example. I think we could all take a lesson from Rutherford County at the department, and sometimes we just need to fund and get out of the way. So I like this.
It clearly is exciting and can be a model for the entire state. So.
Yes, sir.
Any other further questions? Okay, now, can I have a motion to accept on final reading? Mr. Ferguson moves. Do I have a second? Mr. Edwards seconds. Further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye. Aquinas, TTU, and Rutherford, all three. Good. Okay. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. We'll be really excited to see how that program goes.
Yes, sir. Me too. Thank you.
That finishes our items on final reading. Next are DHS defaults. Ms. Kendrick, Ms. McCann.
Good morning again, members. So on information, you all have a list of educators from the Department of Human Services that have defaulted on their court-ordered obligation for child support pursuant to our board rule and state law. When this happens, they are to be automatically suspended until they come into compliance. And so this list is presented to you all as on information as they are automatically suspended under the law and rule until they come into compliance.
Any questions for Ms. Kendrick? Do I have a motion then to accept, or do we have to?
You don't have to, it's
Okay.
just on the information.
Just information, don't do anything. Okay. Next item are our educator licensure items.
We don't know if it's okay with you all sit, because there may be a lot of discussion. like we
Say
did
that
last
again?
time. If it's okay with you all, Hannah and I are gonna sit like we did last time,
Oh,
because there may be a
absolutely.
lot of discussion.
Well, first, there have been three that have been requested to be pulled for individual discussions. And those were C, F, and I, Lamming, Patterson, and Polanski. The others we'll vote on consent. So maybe we can go ahead and take a motion for those right now.
I move that we vote on the items not pulled in support of the recommendation made by the state board staff in each of those respective cases.
We have a motion from Ms. Tucker to accept those with items that haven't been pulled, accept the recommendation. Do I have a second? Second. I have a second by Mr. Ferguson. Any further discussion on those? Because these are licensure actions, it does require a roll call vote. Mr. Griffin?
Mr. Cobbins. Mr. Darnell. Mr. Eby.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards. Aye. Mr. Ferguson. Ms. Kim.
Aye.
Ms. Tucker.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 7 ayes, 0 nays.
That motion passes as recommended. Next item. We're going to do number C first.
Madam Chairman Eby and members, is before you, you have the item C, Aaron Lamming. The recommendation is a 1-year suspension with professional development. Ms. Lamming was a theater teacher at Centennial High School in Williamson County. They reported her for having inappropriate physical contact with students, along with other personnel matters, and then a failure to report a child abuse between students issue. And the recommendation, again, is a 1-year suspension. I'm happy to take any specific questions about her, or you all can just enter into discussion, and we can, if there's a harsher recommendation, we can go from there.
Ms. Tucker.
So I pulled this as I pulled the others, and I know I say this just about every meeting, but I feel like it's important to just sort of set the sort of context before we address these, that and I know a lot of you agree, this is the worst part of this job, is going through these teacher discipline files. And even though they're a small percentage of our educators in our state, they color the view of educators, in my opinion, in a poor way and in a way that shouldn't happen because they are a small percentage. I also get increasingly concerned over these past 5 years that because there are so many egregious things in this small percentage, that we sometimes look at the ones that are less egregious and like their conduct is almost normalized because of the really bad stuff. It's like, well, they didn't rape anybody, so therefore we should let them be a teacher. And I really want to just sort of be have an individualized approach to each of these personally. Because, the other ones here were all mostly revocations, like rape by an authority figure, relationships with your 15-year-old students, and you guys know, drugs, all sorts of awful things that were easy questions. And these 3 that I pulled are harder questions, but I still think they're worth discussing. So Ms. Lamming is in my county. So although I try to look at all of these as if would I allow my child to be in that classroom, it's a little more real when it is actually in my county. she is a theater teacher, and I was a theater major, and, you know, I get the whole theater teachers are touchy-feely. However, she is reportedly on a couch under a blanket with students. She's rubbing their shoulders. She's, you know, like, she's very close to them. I am also concerned when I'm looking at this in the full context that she had several improvement plans. So, you know, this is not a, like, she's the most amazing teacher ever, but she's touchy-feely situation. Not for purposes of the legal requirement that you would have in a hearing, but for purposes of when I'm looking at should she be a teacher. She had 3 reprimands. She is noted in her file as being dishonest. And so I don't know the right answer here. I pulled it for conversation, a 1-year suspension, which apparently based on the order would be effective when the order was signed, not retroactive, which is an improvement.
So from today's date, so if you all voted to approve the 1-year
Okay.
suspension to go into effect today, going forward.
And so, I mean, I just wanted to put this one out there because her being suspended for a year as a teacher, while I understand is a burden on her, I look at whether she should be a teacher, and you know, or whether that's enough, and whether you know what professional development looks like that teaches you not to be cuddled with a student on a couch under a blanket. I don't know. I mean, those are the questions that I have.
Thank you. Further thoughts, comments, questions?
Was this the one where there was some disagreement in what several students saw?
Yes, so in regards to the incident where she was alone, it was, I don't think there is any dispute that she was alone with the student in the classroom, but one student said she was alone under a blanket, one said cuddling, one said watching Netflix. So the students who reported the incident all gave different accounts, but there's no dispute that obviously she was alone with the student in the classroom.
Okay. Netflix, you say.
So in our matrix of actions that we can take, where does the 1 year fit in that? Is that at the front phase? Is it sort of in the middle? Is it toward the ending of it? What?
So this would be considered under our matrix inappropriate physical contact without harm. The 1 year suspension falls right in the middle. It ranges from formal reprimand to a 2-year suspension, so it's right splitting.
Other thoughts?
Oh, well,
Yeah,
I
Mr.
think-
Darnell.
I think one of the disappointing things, and which goes back to what you said, is that there have been several incidents over a period of years. This was not, and the school system put the plans in place, but, I mean, these were some, I mean, when you put it on a scale, I mean, they were not small things. So it, you know, and part of that, it comes back to the school system. Why did you continue to allow her to teach? You know, she was given the chance, put on a plan, broke it again, broke it again. So I think there's some fault there with Williamson County of why did you not start the separation process before now we've gotten to this point. So just wanted to put that out there.
Does that affect your thinking on the length of time that you might have this suspension?
Not necessarily, because ultimately it comes back to her. So I think in that respects, you know, I can go either way as far as that goes. Well, ultimately, she made this decision to do what she did. The school, you know, even though the school played a role in allowing her to still be there, she was the one who had the conduct. It was her decision to be alone with the student. It was her decision to touch, you know, rub somebody's shoulders or whatever. So,
But the fact,
I see fault on.
But the fact that there has been some repetitive action here, which I think is what Ms. Tucker is bringing up, does the 1 year seem consistent with that, or should we extend that? We need a motion one way or the other, so what is the desire from people? We have a motion?
I make a motion to remove this from the agenda today to recommend a harsher punishment. I would recommend the 2-year suspension, which is, I understand, the maximum that we can give. And that's my understanding, since it wasn't of a sexual nature, even though, whatever. But that would be my, yeah, that would be my recommendation. So that's my motion.
Can I ask how we define inappropriate physical contact?
Inappropriate physical contact is defined as unlawful, unnecessary, and/or unjustified physical contact with the student. Examples of such unnecessary and unjustified contact include, but are not limited to, sexual contact, physical altercations, horseplay, tickling, improper use of corporal punishment, and roughhousing. And then there is another inappropriate physical contact with harm, which is inappropriate physical contact as described in subparagraph E, which I just read, that results in physical or mental harm or the potential of physical or mental harm to a student.
So if I think about this, there does not appear to have been any physical harm that we know of, or any mental harm. I don't disagree with Ms. Tucker's desire to extend it, because I think it is a repetitive case, which says probably I wouldn't put it right in the middle, but I might not take it all the way to the 2 years, so I'm thinking maybe 18 months as a possible.
I would accept that as a friendly amendment to my motion.
Okay. So we have a motion, we need a second on that would basically take this back for further consideration of a harsher punishment, looking at 18 months as opposed to 1 year. Do I have a second on that motion? We have a second from Mr. Edwards. Any further discussion? No further discussion. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any nays? Motion passes. Okay. Next one, Ms. Tucker, you want to?
I don't know. F is Mr. Patterson. This was a recommended 2-year suspension, and I mean, your question, Mr. Evie, about the span of what we can do here is a good one. This is the teacher who talked about marrying his students and bringing them to the Eiffel Tower, and then there was an incident which may have just been a giant misunderstanding when a student was wearing a sports bra and he commented on it in a way that apparently didn't sit right with the student because it wound up being reported. So this was just creepy to me. Again, it's not my district, but I think about, I just think about what that leads to. And I know we had a conversation on our one-on-one call that he didn't do anything. He didn't have sexual relations with them. And my problem with that is that I don't want to wait to get there if there are signs that that's a risk. And if he is totally innocent and just creepy without any intent, I'm sorry for that, but I would rather err on the side of protecting students than err on the side of protecting his right to be a teacher.
So this one falls under which criteria, and what's the range on that one?
So this one would fall under the inappropriate communication of a non-explicit nature. The range of that one starts at a 3-month suspension and runs through revocation. It's pretty much the full range. It just doesn't include permanent revocation.
Comments, thoughts?
If I can just say, I don't want to understate the impact of a 2-year suspension, and I don't know if a 2-year suspension is the right thing here or not, but when I went through this, it made me uncomfortable, and that's why I wanted to raise it.
Any desire to do anything differently, or do we have a motion to accept anything differently? We have a recommendation from the State Board staff for a 2-year suspension. Is there a motion to accept that recommendation? Have a motion made by Mr. Cobbins. Is there a second to accept that? Second by Mr. Darnell. Any further discussion? I think that we do hear what you're saying, Ms. Tucker, and I think there's a lot of it. But this is a licensure, so we'll require a roll call vote. Mr. Griffin.
Mr. Cobbins. Mr. Darnell. Mr. Eby.
Aye.
Mr. Edwards. Aye. Mr. Ferguson. Aye. Ms. Kim. Aye. Ms. Tucker.
No.
Mr. Chairman, you have 6 yeas, 1 nay.
Motion passes. Thank you.
And if I could, Chairman, I would want to point out too that like we struggle with these as well, as you all are struggling in case review, and the discussion that Wendy is bringing up, we bring up in case review, and oftentimes we spend 2 to 3 hours in case review talking about these cases. So I do want to say, even though I know there is some disagreement or discussion or wanting harsh or not, we have these same conversations in case review, and it's hard for us as well to come to some kind of agreement as a staff as to what is the appropriate recommendation to bring to you all in the confines of our rule and the law and where we have the matrix is done. So.
And we appreciate all that you do. This is not fun for us. I know it's not fun for you, so thank you.
The final one is Alice Polanski. And that recommendation was a 3-month suspension, and this was one that actually shockingly bothered me quite a bit. And before I go into that, I know we do this on the one-on-one call. We have this conversation about how I value the staff's work on this. I appreciate it. It is nothing. It is not a statement. As a lawyer, I understand the legal analysis you have to do, but as a board member, it's a different analysis. And so I don't want to take away anything from the analysis that they do or the recommendations that they give, because I have the utmost respect for them. I just happen to, as a board member, have a different perspective. So this lady, elementary school teacher, and what's undisputed, I think, is that she called an elementary school student she called the student a bitch, I guess, is right. And it's disputed whether she hit that student with a rolled up piece of paper or whether the piece of paper touched the student. She seemed to want to go over that. The paperwork indicates from other elementary school students, and I think that part is really important here. One of the students wrote that she cussed at us all day, every day. There were other similar comments by these children. There was a prior incident in her file of being accused of shoving a student. She said I guess, I don't remember, it was something like I touched the student and they fell or flew across the room or whatever. I had and I understand there was no proof of that happening, but the fact that that's there and then this is there and that her excuse on all of this is, oh, I just touched them, it just all really bothered me. And so I think about my elementary school student, my child, and whether I would ever be okay with one of her teachers calling her, I might think it in my head on occasion, but a teacher referring to students that way. I also, I believe, based on what I saw from what school this is, that this is a high poverty school. These are kids that education in many ways, like school is like their way of finding, a path to success in life, and it's important that they are surrounded by adults who they can model and respect. And so I just had this gave me a visceral reaction. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay. Other comments about this case? Are you looking for?
Can we get an analysis of where it is on the spectrum?
Sure. So as you have stated, what's undisputed is the fact that she called the student a derogatory name. So primarily this is going to be based on inappropriate communication
that is non-explicit, because that is where this would fall within the definitions of the rule. That ranges from 3 months all the way up to revocation.
Let me ask this question. There was, if I recall correctly, there was some discussion about shoving into a table or something like that.
Yes, so whenever this report was received from this school district, they included some documentation of a prior disciplinary investigation that they engaged in against this particular educator some years back. They included it in the documentation with this report that they submitted. However, those allegations, the district was unable to substantiate them. They were deemed to be unfounded by the district, and in the absence of our own investigator, we have to rely heavily upon the evidence that we receive from the districts. So when they are unable to substantiate certain allegations that come from them, we don't factor those into our recommendations.
I tend to agree that 3 months seems a little light. And, I think at least 6 months or something, I would support a motion by Ms. Tucker if she wanted to send us back for further discussion.
So, the character of someone who can use this type of language, which is substantiated by kids who aren't clever enough to conspire. I mean, I believe what they're saying. I agree we send it back. My heartburn is, will there be a significant difference when the teacher returns to class? I don't know what can happen in that period of time.
And Mr. Chairman, I will say, whenever we reviewed this case in case review, the district did submit some documentation showing that this educator learned from the experience. She completed some of the professional development training voluntarily. Her principal submitted his own statement saying, she really learned from this. She's changed her ways. She's not behaving this way anymore in the classroom. So for what that's worth, it does seem like this would not be something that we would be in danger of having recurring in the classroom. We do have that evidence in the file at least.
I appreciate that. If I have faith, that much faith in professional development, I have a lot of problems with this. One of the problems is that she did this, and I get feeling angry and overwhelmed and all of that stuff, but that she did it. A bigger problem is that I think I don't think she, while she did professional development, it was after she got told by the district, we don't believe you. And I'm looking at their letter to her. You admitted to calling the student a derogatory name after becoming frustrated. You unequivocally denied hitting the student. Contrary to your assertions, our investigation revealed witnesses observed you hit the student. Again, it was on the head with paper. I understand that. If it was hitting, we'd have a different conversation here. But she was lying too, and that's a problem. For me, if I lose my temper, which happens, everybody's here shocked by that, lose my temper and do something, then you say, oh my God, I can't believe I did all that. And she's picking and choosing what she's lying about, and that to me is just a red flag. And I don't know what training do you get that makes you not react that way. And and again, you can't consider it in your legal analysis, right? Because if we don't reach an agreement with her, she goes to court. She has the right to go to court anyway, right? And have a hearing, and a judge hears all this. And so you have to figure out what's admissible, what's not admissible. We don't have to do that for purposes of our recommendation, right? We just have to figure out what we think should happen to her. And then, if we don't, then you get lawyers are stuck with what the lawyers are stuck with. I get that. And so this whole shoving a kid into a desk that they didn't have proof of, smoke and fire to me, right? If there's no proof of that, but she did this and lied about it, I don't know. I don't want her in a classroom, but.
So, do we have a motion to, Mr. Weather?
Is the motion to send it back?
I haven't heard a motion yet.
If we don't accept this, then we send it back and ask for.
You make a motion to send it back and ask for reconsideration, look at a longer suspension time.
And do we specify the longer
We can do that.
Why don't you do that? Let's take I gotta, we'll write it down.
Is there, one more question, is there, I'm looking at the consent order, but you're gonna do this faster than I can read through it. Is there anything in the consent order that requires her to do anything other than serve a suspension?
There's not in this particular one. We dropped our typical requirement of professional development because that had already been completed at the district level. So it's just straight up the suspension.
So I am gonna make a motion that it be withdrawn and that the recommendation, I don't know how this is gonna go with everybody else here, but that the recommendation be a 2-year suspension with the requirement that she attend and successfully complete anger management.
We have a motion. Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Is there further discussion? My feeling is 2 years is too long under the circumstances. Pardon?
Yeah, I was gonna agree, I think 2 years.
I mean, so we have a motion on the floor. We can vote on that motion. Roll call vote.
Mr. Cobbins? Mr. Darnell?
No.
Mr. Eby?
No.
Mr. Edwards?
Aye.
Mr. Ferguson?
No.
Ms. Kim? Ms. Tucker?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 3 yeas and 4 nays.
So the motion as proposed, as submitted, fails. We still have the action that we have to take some action. We have a recommendation of 3 months. I think we have maybe a desire for a longer period of time, but maybe not 2 years.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr.
I'd
Cobb.
like to make a motion that we recommend 6 months with required documentation from an anger management program or class.
We have a motion on the table for 6 months with required documentation for anger management. Do we have a second to that motion? We have a second to that motion. Any further discussion on that? Okay. Mr. Griffin, you want a roll call?
Mr. Cobbins? Mr. Darnell? Mr. Eby?
Aye.
Mr. Edwards? Mr. Ferguson? Ms. Kim?
No.
Ms. Tucker?
No.
Mr. Chair, you have
Okay.
5 ayes and 2 nays.
The motion passes as recommended. That finishes our issues associated with the licensure. We had one more topic I want to bring up. Yesterday in the workshop, we had pulled the accountability topic. We did say that we were going to continue to work on that, and per the Chairman Hartgrove, she is appointing a accountability subcommittee consisting of Mr. Darnell, Mr. Cobbins, and myself, and at the request of Chairman Hartgrove, I will serve as the subcommittee chairman for that. Our intention is to work together and work with the department, and we will not be submitting anything that we don't bring back to the board. I hope to do that later this year. Any further comments or questions that people have before we adjourn?
I want to say 2 things. First, I appreciate that conversation and that debate, and that's what I think we're supposed to be doing, and I think that's really healthy. The second thing is I want to thank my ULF fellows for sitting through our board meeting, and maybe they can get a picture with our board chair and board members and executive director before we go.
Thank you. And I too, I think, I just really think this is a great board, that we're not hesitant to bring up difficult items and to talk about our feelings. And I think that collectively as a board, we come up with the right decision. So based on that, I will remind you that our next meeting is on the 15th of November at Carson Newman in Jefferson City. We look forward to that. Pardon?
So use that gavel one more time.
I'm going to. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor McNally. I'll try not to break this. The meeting is adjourned.